All right. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined once again by Vernon Whalan. How you doing?
Doing all right, man. How are you doing?
I am okay. I'm getting ready to move, so I'm kind of right in the middle of all that, but it's a little stressful, but otherwise I'm good. So of course, it's not what we're talking about tonight, but it'd be a little weird not to mention that, this afternoon, still in my time zone, we got two big pieces of news. One, which is by far the one that most people are talking about, is that for the first time in American history, a former president has been convicted of a bunch of felonies, which, you know, I actually just finished writing something about this for Jacobin. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but my take on this is that it's good that presidents are subjected to the rule of law. You know, kings and emperors are supposed to be above that. Public officials in democratic republics aren't, you know. So if somebody falsifies business records to cover up a hush money payment, that's something an ordinary mortal would be convicted of a crime for. So I'm glad that Trump was too. There is a pretty appalling double standard here, but because there are other ex-presidents who've gotten away with much, much, much worse crimes. But, I don't think the right way to resolve the double standard is to give Trump a pass to commit a few crimes if they don't matter very much, right? I think it's to, ideally to, put George W. Bush in prison. Obviously, that's not happening anytime soon. But, if you're going to complain about the double standard, that's how I'd like to resolve it.
And I'm sure Trump has committed worse crimes as well.
Oh, my God, yeah.
Certainly not these are not the crimes that we all want him. Most of us want him prosecuted for.
Yeah, I mean, look, he did assassinations, John Bolton, his former national security advisor, had that fascinating moment like a year or so ago where he was like, yeah, I've helped plan some coups, when he was like on TV talking about January 6th. So it's like, yeah, there might be something there that might be prosecution worthy, find out exactly what he was referring to. Certainly, in terms of...
I mean, Trump had an American citizen assassinated on American soil by basically like Department of Justice, like cops in Portland or in Oregon, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And the extent to which there's any debate over how legal that was is just a reflection of how fucked up the laws might be if it is legal, but yeah, certainly I think you and I would probably like to see Trump or any president prosecuted for other things. But I guess that's part of it, maybe, is they can't start prosecuting him for shit they're all doing,
Yeah, no, I think that's it. I think that's why, like, these really petty crimes are what a president finally gets busted over, and not any of the like really extreme crimes that, God, I'd actually forgotten about what you mentioned. I mean, as you were saying, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Like,
if you never heard of it, like, I feel like I would sound like a crazy person saying something like that,
Yeah, I mean, I had heard of it, but I haven't thought about it.
No, I know.
Certainly Barack Obama essentially extrajudicially assassinated two American citizens, at least, Anwar and Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, with drone strikes. Gave them a kind of posthumous trial by presidential press conference. That's pretty bad, and again, I mean, George W. Bush, the wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan certainly violated the constitutional requirement about declarations of war, and also the UN Charter, which, forbids aggressive war. The U.S. is a signatory to that, and the Constitution says that foreign treaties have the full force of domestic law. and certainly the establishment of like a worldwide regime of torture and CIA black sites, indefinite detention, including of American citizens like Jose Padilla, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I mean, Bush's potential rap sheet is incredibly long, but on the other hand, he seems to have charmed the media by like hanging out with Michelle Obama at events.
And one last take on that, I feel like for me, it's just, I think after all my work with prisoners over the years, I'm pretty confident that at the very least, if Trump has to run for president from prison, he'll have much better people around him than he does in the free world.
Fair enough. Yeah, not that there isn't some overlap there. There are quite a few people who've been around him in the past who have since been convicted of various things. But no, I mean, look, that's funny. I'm not going to improve on that. So I will just move on to say that the other piece of news that happened today, which is really funny how much this overshadowed it. Like if you look at the New York Times, at least as of an hour or two ago, last time I glanced at it, it has all caps, Trump guilty on all counts at the top of it. And you have to like scroll down a while to get to the breaking news item. Not a while, but you have to scroll down a bit, right? To get to the breaking news item that they had announced and emailed about everybody about a couple hours earlier, which was Biden approves U.S. weapons to be used by Ukraine in strikes inside Russia.
Yes,
which is like, okay, so I mean, this is really like the ultimate symptom of the way in the Trump era, all news ends up getting cleaved into like Trump news and everything else. So it's like even a escalation in tensions between nuclear powers that would have been beyond unimaginable in 2021. I mean, really, like, I don't think people take this stuff seriously enough, but imagine if the headline were the other way around, right? That Russia had given some client state approval to use weapons on attacks inside the United States. Like that's like, yeah. Here's the important thing, right? Trump, and then, scroll down a bit. Oh yeah, U.S. weapons to be used in strikes inside Russia. I mean, God, like really try to imagine that headline in like the 1980s.
Yeah. And, if we keep doing shit like this and we push them to that point, all the next headlines are going to be like, oh my God, Russia says they allow whichever country to, where's this coming from? We were just over here minding our own business. Yeah. And out of nowhere, Russia's threatening to allow other countries to use weapons in the United States.
Exactly. All right. Well, moving from the clock inching a minute or two closer to midnight in Eastern Europe to the horror show in the Middle East. This is a debate that I've been thinking about. It wasn't that many weeks ago that it happened, but since then I've been thinking, we really need to figure out a good time to watch this, just because I really want to watch it. This is Dave Smith, who is somebody who, actually 3 of the 4 people have been in debates that we've covered in one way or another on this channel before. So Dave Smith is somebody, I don't know, frenemy of the show. He's in terms of domestic policy, he's like a crazy libertarian who wants to privatize the sidewalks. But so there's some very, very deep core disagreements there, obviously. But he is very good on stuff like this. And there's also Cenk Uygur, of course, from the Young Turks, who's on the same side as him here. And they're debating Israel-Palestine, Iran with Batya Ungar-Sargon, which I saw Charles said in the chat earlier, sounds like part of a Lovecraftian incantation. But she's the editor at like Newsweek since since that sort of went from being the Newsweek we remember from back when to being like a very conservative outlet. and also, and she's certainly a very ardent Zionist. And of course, Dennis Prager, who probably requires no description, right? He is what he is, the man behind the YouTube university. So with no, and it's being moderated by Sagar and Jetty, the conservative half of Breaking Points, which is, I actually think is like just as like a news analysis show is like pretty decent. I watch it pretty often, but in any case, with no further ado, let's give it a watch.
To everybody here. And so I think with that, I'm going to offer some opening statements. I'll give everybody, let's say, a couple of minutes, like 3 minutes or so. And so with that, I think we should go ahead and start. We'll start with you, Dennis. Dennis Prager is the founder of Prager University and the host of the Dennis Prager radio show. On the topic, is Israel's invasion of Gaza morally justified? Let's start there, which is the stated topic. Go ahead, sir.
So thank you very much. Thank you all who are watching. By the way, which is my camera? Because I want to talk to the audience.
Go ahead. I think it's...
Is that it over there? Hi, everybody.
Right.
Thank you for having me. The dilemma in the Middle East has always been the same from the beginning of Israel's creation in 1948, and that is that its neighbors do not want there to be a Jewish state in their midst. That is the entire problem. One side, as I have put it all of my life, one side wants the other side dead. And in case you were in doubt about it, October 7th should have made that clear. If you really want to have a serious moral debate, and one should, and you're not already committed to the anti-Israel side, I have a question. And I think this question more or less clarifies everything. If Israel announced, we are disarming and we will fight no longer, what would happen? If the Palestinians said, we are disarming and we will fight no longer, what would happen? If you are intellectually honest, you know the answer to the question. The day after Israel announced it disarmed, you would have an October 7th of the entire population of Israel. There would be finally an actual genocide, not the false accusation of Israeli genocide in Gaza. If the Palestinians announced that the next day, or perhaps the next week, there would be peace. This is the only time, as the little excerpt I saw when I spoke at Oxford and debated this issue, this is the only case in modern history where people believe the democracy, the free state, the state with an opposition press, an opposition party, civil rights for all its citizens, including its 2 million Arab citizens, the peace-loving state, the democracy, is the aggressor, and the police state that tortures its opponents, they're the good guys. That is how inverted it is. I have a theory as to why everything is inverted, and I believe it is because it is the one Jewish state in the world. There are 22 Arab states. There are 52 Muslim states. There are 200 states around about that number all over the world. Only one is targeted for extinction. There is no other state targeted for extinction, only the one Jewish state the size of New Jersey. And so that is the issue. One side wants the other side dead, and it has been true since 1948.
All right, Dennis, thank you very much.
So given the size of this debate, it's 2 hours long, and the desire to get through it in like a sane amount of time, we obviously can't usually stop this at intervals this short, but there's so much in that opening that we really do need to stop to unpack this a bit.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so I feel like my notes even start in the middle, like it's hard to know where to start, but I think the main point that he's trying to make in his opening is about this question he has of if what would happen if Israel surrendered versus what would happen if the Palestinians surrendered. And then he answers that question, which is he believes that there would be a genocide of the Israelis. And I feel like this is a little bit of a false equivalency, I admit, because it's not exactly what he's describing, but we kind of already know the answer to what would happen if the Palestinians at least like put down their arms, because there's some version of that in the Great March of Return in 2018, and the Israelis just they targeted people who were very far away from the border. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about this. Like, I don't need to go through the whole record, but
yeah, but basically, lots of people were shot for getting too close to the border fence during a mostly nonviolent, like attempt at nonviolent resistance, right? So, and you certainly look at the way, Israel has been, like, just in the last week, I mean, those Israeli Arab citizens that he just mentioned, people have been arrested for like Facebook posts that decrying, the slaughter in Rafah, for example. There's, certainly people are barred from the country for supporting BDS, so the idea that, there's like a like, again, I think people sometimes make conclusions from this that aren't really justified, but I think that the premise is totally true that, like, yeah, I mean, I think Israel has shown that they're more than prepared to violently crack down on nonviolent resistance to the occupation. And certainly if you look at, even before that, like, if you look at a Palestinian group, ceasing hostilities, then, the classic example would be Oslo, right? That there's that, and what happened, during the 8 years between the signing of the Oslo Accords and everything falling apart again, is that there was continuous building of settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. And certainly, like, right now, I mean, it's like this, it's like so weak and weird, like, that he's relying on this totally untestable hypothetical about what would happen now, that and it's also ambiguous. Does lay down your arms mean that, like, all of your arms just, like, disappeared? You lost the ability to shoot back if you were shot at? Or does lay down your arms mean you cease fighting? Because if Israel ceased fighting, then I don't think anybody thinks that would, like, lead to any of that stuff that he just said.
I agree. And in fact, there's a long history of Israel awaiting and searching for a pretext to engage in a conflict with other countries or an invasion. And when they don't get one, they just start provoking the other country, in some cases attack the other country. And even leading up to October 7th, there were various attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank that some cases seem to have state protection. And
like,
and
unprecedented level. Yeah. I mean, like, there's an area that's like almost 10% of the West Bank that's been mostly cleared of Palestinians before October 7th because those attacks, right? But it's like, yeah, look, if Israel just stopped fighting, if that's the hypothetical, then I think, but nothing else changed, I think we'd go back to the status quo. I think that's pretty obvious. If you're saying, oh, well, Israel, like, if what he really means is that, like, every gun disappeared from the Israeli military somehow, right? Even though it's like one of the largest armies in the world, then, like, oh, would there be attacks? Yeah, sure. But, like, but if every gun disappeared from every Palestinian, right? Like what makes you think that you wouldn't have many, many more of those settler pogroms than have already happened? I mean, that's just, like, and again, this is all kind of hypothetical. And the thing that's, like, really, the thing that seems particularly lazy about this opening presentation to me is that he's not just talking about the Palestinians, right? He's talking about Israel's neighbors, right? Like, that's how he started. Like, I'm remembering that, right? Like he said, Israel's neighbors don't want Israel to exist. So it's like, oh, you have one side that wants the other side not to exist. Like, well, hold on. Israel's neighbors have all signed on to something called the Arab Peace Initiative way back in 2002. So for the last 22 years, Israel's neighbors have all signed on to this document that lays out the conditions under which they would be willing to accord full diplomatic recognition to the state of Israel. It's basically, withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, allow a Palestinian state to be formed there. And, there's some turn of phrase like a honorable solution or something to the refugee problem, which seems like diplomatic speak for like allow a token number to return and like admit wrongdoing so we can, put the issue to bed, but we don't really expect you to take everybody back. So for the last 22 years, the stated position of all of Israel's neighbors is that under these very simple conditions, which are like, Israel fulfilling its bare minimum obligations under international law as far as withdrawing from the territories, and not even that as far as the refugees go, that under those conditions, they're willing to recognize the state of Israel and fully normalize diplomatic relations. That's been 22 years. That's been the case. There's no equivalent on the other side that, that like, there's no equivalent of like, if, some Palestinian group or, Israel's neighbors do X, Y, and Z, then Israel will recognize the state of Palestine. There's been no offer like that on the table ever, really. Like, I mean, there have been specific diplomatic proposals back and forth, right? But like, there's never been a like public commitment that just fulfill these very minimal conditions and will recognize the state of Palestine, right? That's never happened.
Right. Yeah, and I mean that's partly why I said too at the beginning that like I admit it's like it's a false comparison, even like the one I made, because what Prager is describing is just that they will just give up and like get no concessions, just stopping the fighting, releasing the hostages, whatever that means to him, would just end all of this. And so I think that like even the comparison I made is like giving him too much credit, because what he's describing is just a complete fantasy. Like,
yeah, and also like, look, I mean,
it's not true,
Yeah, it's not true.
Or if Hamas surrendered, I don't think that would end this.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if Hamas just released remaining hostages unilaterally and like announced their intention to fight no more, then do you think there's any chance whatsoever that the Netanyahu government would say, okay, all is forgiven, then we're going to stop like attempted to kill, members of Hamas, right? Never mind it. Like, of course not. Right. Like, it's like, they'd be like, no, well, we're still going to track down and kill everybody who's involved in October 7th. And if that means that we have to kill a couple tens of more thousands of Palestinian civilians, so be it. Right. I mean, I think everything about the track record of Israel's current government, suggests that to me. But like, it just, I mean, again, I know ultimately that's unfalsifiable, but so is what Dennis said, right? Like, it's just, instead of defending the things that Israel has actually done, he's just asserting that in this like Israel fan fiction scenario he made up in his head, it plays out in a way that like makes Israel look good. It's like, okay, well, what does that prove?
Right.
Cenk, why don't we go to you, founder of the Young Turks? Go ahead.
Yeah. So first of all, we should clarify the question, because if we're saying, hey, was Israel right to go in the first place after October 7th? I say yes, but it depends on how and how long do you stay, how do you conduct affairs, etc. If we're talking about how Israel has conducted this war and whether they should still be in there, that's a hard no. It's not even close. It's been absolutely atrocious what they've done. And not only has it killed over 33,000 Palestinians, with probably a lot more than that inside the rubble, 76,000 wounded, 1.1 million people starving. If you think that that is good for Israel, I think that you ought to have a sanity check. So not only is it devastating for the Palestinians, potentially devastating for the world, as Netanyahu now agitates for a broader war with Iran engulfing the entire Middle East, which will be catastrophic for America and the world. But for Israel itself, if you want a safe haven for Jews, you must stop the occupation. 75 long, brutal years. So it's one thing to say, hey, theoretically, Hamas would do this. And by the way, I'm then going to say all Palestinians would do that, or all Muslims would do that. That's a dangerous area to go to, right? It's another thing to say, yes, well, while they theoretically don't want our state to exist, we are actually preventing their state from existing. I mean, it's such an ironic argument. Hey, we prevented their state for 75 long years. We prevented them from having freedom for 75 long years. We brutalized them in every possible way. We've humiliated them in every possible way. Number one, we can't believe they're fighting back. Are you serious? We'll talk a lot about this in the debate. But so would people have been surprised if Jews fought back against the Germans during World War II? Would that have been terrorism? Is that what it would have been? That's outrageous to say that. Of course, Jews should have been able to fight back against the Germans. Any occupied people should be able to fight back. We can go to Armenians fighting back against the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so those are my original people. I'm Turkish descent. And if you said, well, the Armenians, how dare they? They should have loved the Turks. And they should have said the Turks are the greatest people on earth. And they should have been occupied and accepted their occupation. I can't believe they fought back. And you know what? When the Turks moved them and killed them, they were just defending themselves. They have a right to defend themselves. Guys, if you're in that camp, I don't think you understand how biased you sound and how it does not sound to anyone outside of your camp that you're in a rational world. So if you want Israel to be safe, you must end the occupation. It is not optional. So is the goal here to say, as Netanyahu is clearly saying now, he's saying, I do not want a two-state solution. Permanent occupation means permanent war, permanent terrorism, and a disaster for Israel, let alone the Palestinians.
Got it. Batya, why don't you go ahead? Batya Ungar-Sargon, she is opinion editor at Newsweek, and she's the author of Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women, which we have a copy of on the desk right over there. She was so kind to give us one. Go ahead, Batya. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here with this panel. Are we all in agreement that Israel was just to invade after October 7th? Cenk, you agreed with that. Dennis, you obviously agreed with that. I agree with that. Dave, are you in agreement that that was a just?
I would say, like Cenk, it depends on what you mean by
what
invade.
followed.
Sure.
But the initial invasion itself, you could see that from a just point, that that would have been justified based on October 7th, based on had they conducted themselves. There was a way that Israel could have conducted itself that you would have felt comfortable with that as a reaction to October 7th. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, look, if you're spending your opening asking me a question, it's a fairly complex question, but I would certainly say that Israel was more than justified in pursuing and killing anybody who was involved in October 7th.
Why don't we cut the questions there? Continue with your opening statement. We'll get to
Well,
yeah.
I think that's very important because then we can narrow the scope of the debate. It doesn't have to be about whether the war is just, but whether Israel's behavior since invading was just and the way that it has carried it out. And I think the answer to that is very clearly yes, because first of all, the measures that Israel has taken, obviously, we look at the destruction and it is horrifying. We see these children, we see women, we see people being impacted in the most horrific way. And it looks horrible. But the reality is that war is horrible. And the thing that we have to determine is Israel engaged in a war or in war crimes, right? Is Israel engaged in a justified response to a heinous attack, or is it going and doing things that are beyond the pale? And the evidence seems to suggest that Israel is not only behaving in a way that every other army has behaved in a very similar situation, but in a much more careful way, despite the massive destruction. And the evidence for that is in the efforts that they have made, the millions and millions of phone calls they make. You understand that Israel telegraphs to the enemy before every single thing that it does in Gaza. They're literally giving away the plan in order to get civilians out of harm's way. Now, can more be done? More can always be done. But have they gone further than any army in human history? The answer is yes. The number 33,000. Last week, Hamas put out a statement on Telegram in which they said they cannot account for 11,000 of those. So Hamas itself reduced the number to 22,000, which means that if you take the number of Hamas soldiers who have been killed, right? Israel says 13,000. Hamas itself in February admitted to 6,000. We're talking about a ratio of combatants to non-combatants that, again, simply has not been seen in urban warfare. All of these things, I think, come together to suggest that despite the enormous devastation, and I'm with you on that emotionally, we have to analyze this objectively and conclude that if you are saying 33,000 as the number of dead, you are mourning the butchers. And I think that's shameful. I think it's really important that people who are mourning the civilians make sure that they are careful, that they are not mourning exactly what we all have agreed on, which is that the butchers, Israel had every right, not just every right, but a moral right and a moral obligation to kill them.
Got it. Thank you, Batya. Dave?
Yeah, anyone's estimate of the number of Hamas fighters is just made up. It's there's no way to know that. And saying like there's some Hamas thing that's supposedly said some number, completely irrelevant, right? The Ministry of Health is like an apolitical medical organization. Its numbers have always been accurate before. They keep a very careful count. And if anything, it's overwhelmingly likely that again, their numbers were accurate after past conflicts like in 2009, 2014. But the scale of the destruction wasn't nearly as bad in those instances, and particularly the scale of destruction of hospitals and medical infrastructure wasn't as bad. So I think just applying a little common sense here, it's overwhelmingly likely that the Ministry of Health numbers are a severe undercount because there's so much medical infrastructure has been destroyed that it's much harder to keep a running count, and they're pretty scrupulous about only doing it when they're sure. So that's just nonsense. And again, I just don't like certainly anything from Israel about how many people they think were Hamas fighters is like just a guess, and it's not even an educated guess.
They're just making shit up.
Yeah.
They put out different
More
numbers
succinctly, yes.
all the time. And also, yeah, just a couple things there. Like I read those UN report that, basically the claim that was reported was that the UN has been misrepresenting the numbers because they're relying on the Ministry of Health, which you just discussed. That was the claim in the mainstream press. But there was an enormous leap from, or at least this is the way it came off to me, from this amount of people haven't been identified to they're not civilians.
Yeah. So the claim, I think the leap that was being made was the UN said, here's the number that we've been able to specifically identify. We know who it is, in other words. The UN is saying, I mean, forget who's a civilian and who's not. Right now, I think that's pretty much unknowable. Like, certainly anything coming from the Israeli side, like, they literally have no way of knowing that, right? So but like, just in terms of number of people killed, like the UN wasn't saying, we think this is the number of people who are killed. The UN was saying, this is the number of people we know who they are who are killed, right? The Ministry of Health isn't like, the Ministry of Health can see when they've got a dead body, whether they know who it is or not. Yeah.
And also another thing she said was, the way that Israel has conducted itself in a way like similar to or better than, I can't remember her exact phrasing, the way that other armies have behaved in a really similar situation. That last part is a direct quote. And again, like, I think I mentioned this on the last show. I don't mean to repeat myself, but that's just not true. Like, I'm not saying that they're identical situations I could compare it to, but we have.
Well, here are some. I mean, how about like the war in Iraq? or
yeah, after 9/11, we did not drop as many bombs in Afghanistan in any year during the war in Afghanistan as Israel has dropped in the past. First of all, then Israel dropped in the first month, let alone the past 7 months, 6 months, wherever we are.
And Afghanistan has 41 million people in it, right? Like, I mean, that's like it's a vastly larger territory than Gaza. So if like there wasn't any year where we dropped as many bombs as Israel's dropped in 7 months, that's pretty telling. And certainly the casualty figures speak for themselves. I mean, that this is, the only way you can get it down to even 1 out of 3 casualties being Hamas fighters is if you just help yourself to the assumption that adult males are all Hamas fighters, because we know about 2/3 of the casualties are women and children. So like, this is what Alan Dershowitz did in his Compact article. He was just like, okay, let's take this as a rough proxy for number of civilians. So that's about 1 out of 3. And then he went on to argue that was an okay number, which because he's a sociopath. But but of course, that's just like, that's a crazy assumption, right? I mean, there are 2.3 million people in Gaza. Lots of them are adult males, and there were only ever an estimated 30,000 Hamas fighters in Gaza. So, there's no way that the majority of adult males killed are Hamas fighters, and strikes this indiscriminate. And also, like, if we're going to compare it to like Iraq or Ukraine, right? And like, those are both cases where I think that like the invading army is like committed like really serious war crimes. Yeah, sure. Like but so both Iraq and Ukraine, I mean, like, look, nothing happened that was remotely comparable. Like Ukraine, they announced with great fanfare earlier this year, like 2 years into the invasion, that an estimated 10,000 Ukrainian civilians had died, right? As opposed to tens of thousands, even on the most generous estimate, where you just help yourself to the assumption that all the adult males were Hamas fighters. That still gives you, well over 20,000 civilians, and out of a population of 2.3 million, as opposed to about 43 million in Ukraine. And even fewer in Iraq, where, again, I mean, I spent a lot of time marching in anti-war protests. I said earlier, and I mean it, that George W. Bush should absolutely be in prison as a war criminal. But the scale of destruction in those cases wasn't anything like this. And like, really, the thing that I think is the most striking to me when you're hearing claims like what Batya is making there is just, look, what's the I think the displacement, more than anything else, tells the story. I mean, the US didn't displace 85% of the Iraqi population from their homes, right, in 2003. Russia didn't displace 85% of Ukrainians from their homes in 2022. But Israel has displaced 85% of Gazans from their homes and is currently bombing the shit out of the last refuge where they told people to move to after they'd already had to flee, in some cases, several other places. So, I mean, this is just like the idea that even if you think that, like, I mean, look, I think that war crimes should be graded on an absolute scale rather than on a curve. But even if we were going to grade them on a curve, say, oh, well, the question is whether Israel has been better or worse than other nations, rather than like saying like the US, for example, has also broken the law. But, even if we were going to grade it on a curve, they still fail on the curve.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the most important point, I think, of what you just said, is that, like, it's not for lack of war crimes in those countries.
No.
It was fucking bad already. But certainly the way that the clip at which Israel does these things, and also I think even before this, the way that they target children is, in particular, pretty brazen, and in much larger numbers.
Yeah. No, exactly. Like, again, there's a reason why even somebody like Dershowitz had to, had to help himself to the assumption that all adult males are presumptively Hamas fighters, because I think he knows that Israel has no idea, can't know, right, until this is over, and you can sort through it and start to make those determinations. I mean, the only people who would have any idea how many Hamas fighters are killed are Hamas. They themselves might have different incentives to tell the truth or not there, but it's not anything Israel's saying. I mean, it's just pure fabulation.
Dave, you can go ahead. Comedian, and he's host of the Part of the Problem podcast. Go ahead, Dave.
Sure. Well, since we have a short opening here, I think I'll just respond to a couple things that I've heard you guys say so far. So one of the things that I notice almost in every war is that it kind of drives people down to this most base collectivist understanding of what's going on here. This side is bad, this side is good, and no one really sees the nuance that there are individuals involved. So, for example, in the war between Ukraine and Russia, you see people who have the Ukrainian flag in their Twitter bio, and they celebrate when there's a Russian defeat, never really considering the fact that many of these Russian young boys were conscripted into this army, and that they're victims too. And when Mr. Prager says one side wants peace and the other side wants to kill all of these people, it's a very convenient collectivist way to look at things. But the objective reality of the situation here is that there have been atrocities on both sides committed against the other side. This is true throughout the history of the existence of Israel. This is true before the existence of the state of Israel, with the Zionist settlers, the British, the Arabs. There were atrocities committed on all sides. And to say that everybody, as if, or to imply that everybody on the Israeli side just wants peace, and everybody on the Palestinian side just wants, that is just not true. There are lots of Palestinians who just want peace, and there are lots of Israelis who want their land and are quite willing and will openly, explicitly say they're willing to do whatever it takes to take their land. Now, to your point about how, you said every single strike they're warned. No, that is just not true. That's objectively not true. They do warn sometimes, but then that also leads to the question of, does that mean that whatever you do is just okay? The reality is that this is not just a war like any other war. And that doesn't mean other wars are justified necessarily, but there's a very big difference in this war compared to almost any other war we could think of. And the major difference that I see is that Israel has dominated the Palestinian people since at least 1967, and we could probably go back before that. Let me just say this. If we look at things in not a collectivist way, and we recognize that there are individuals, and these individuals make up different groups. Let's say we have the group that is Hamas, made up of individuals, but that's Hamas. Within that group, we have the militant Hamas, and we have the political arm of Hamas. They are different. We also have Israel, which is made up of its citizens. We have different political parties within Israel. Okay, let's take this one group for a second, the innocent Palestinians. I hope both of you would concede that such a group does exist. There are some people on the pro-Israel side who will explicitly tell you that that group does not exist. I think if we're being honest with ourselves, there is no group that has been more victimized than the innocent Palestinians. And at a certain point, maybe we ought to think about that group. Nobody has been through it worse than that group, the innocent Palestinians. And at a certain point, I think the question needs to be asked, does Israel have a right to do what it's been doing to the innocent Palestinians for many, many decades now?
Thank you guys very much. You all say.
So, obviously, Dave's a libertarian, so his word choice wouldn't be my word choice, the thing about collectivism, but I actually think what he's using it to say is correct. Right, that Dennis's whole thing relies on treating these like entire ethnic groups like they're hive minds. That like the Palestinians want this, right? The Israelis want that. When in fact, right? I mean, actually, this goes back to Dennis's original thing, where he laid out that ridiculous hypothetical about what he thinks in his mind would happen if each side laid down their arms. It's like, look, we already know, for example, that Israel's now Minister of National Security, Yoav Gallant, will say very openly to the media what he thinks should happen once, Hamas and all of their Palestinian resistance in Gaza has been militarily neutralized. In other words, their arms have been laid down for them, right? After the war is over, he said what should happen is mass population transfer, right? He said voluntary, but, that's like, yeah, you make conditions hellish enough, to get people to accept voluntary transfer so they can have some food and access to hospitals. That's what he's talking about, right? Like lots of Israelis, including multiple cabinet ministers, are very happy to talk like that, right? But like that's obscured when you just use these you have this like reference frame where you're treating groups like hive minds.
Yeah, they've also said things in the past like there's explicit cases where they've said things like they all voted for Hamas, so they're all terrorists. But even less than that, like they've said that they're only trying to target Hamas militants, but in the early stages of the conflict, they were also, of the invasion, they were also saying they didn't know where the militants were. So they're just bombing the whole place,
Yeah, right. And again, you have the president of Israel, saying there are no innocent people in Gaza, right at the beginning, right? That you have in fact several current and former Israeli officials who've gone on TV and said they don't think anybody in Gaza is innocent, right? So Dave's certainly right about that. I also saw somebody in the chat say possibly the most wrong thing you could possibly say, which is that one side can control their crazies, kind of. The other side is crazies in control. So controlling the crazies would presumably mean that there wouldn't be settler pogroms in the West Bank so extensive that about 10% of the West Bank was mostly cleared of its Palestinian population before October 7th. Never mind what's gone on since then, which has been even worse. In fact, presumably it would mean you wouldn't have these armed paramilitary settlements in the first place. Never mind having people who openly advocate genocide have important cabinet positions. So, that's really, really out to lunch. But I also, I guess that's, I guess that's probably good enough for now. Let's keep going.
Stayed within the time limit, which is actually incredible. And Batya, you did steal a little bit of my thunder because, and I'm big glad that you answered that question. Dave and Cenk both responded in that way about how exactly what the question and the superimposed upon that is that do we agree that Israel at least either had a right or was justified in taking some action as a result of October 7th? So
actually, sorry, that did remind me of the one thing I meant to say that I forgot, which is that that saying, okay, there are things I could imagine Israel doing in response to October 7th that would be justified. Even if the answer is yes, that doesn't get you to some sort of fundamental disanalogy between the two sides, right? Because the obvious follow-up question, I don't think Sagar is going to ask it, but the obvious follow-up question would be, okay, given everything that happened leading up to October 7th, would there have been a version of a Hamas incursion into Israel that would have been justified? And it seems like by any standards, according to which the answer to the first question is yes, the answer to the second question obviously has to be yes, because the violence against innocents before then was way more than the 695 Israeli civilians who that's Israel's estimate, right? Out of the 1,200 people who were killed, about 505 or so soldiers and 695 civilians, right? Given that what happened before that, everything leading up to that. The last 18 years of what Gaza went through. I know you told me over text that you've been rereading Norm's book about Gaza. Given all that stuff, right? That's if we just put aside all questions about what's prudential or whatever, and just say, would it have been justified for people who lived in Gaza to respond to all of that with some sort of military operation that only targeted IDF bases and etc., then it's I don't see how you could answer no to that question, but still yes to Israel would be justified in doing some totally different hypothetical response to October 7th besides what it did.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I feel like I was gonna make a similar point, but like, yeah, and I do also think it's all interesting that they just, I mean, I guess Dave and Cenk do a good job of being like, let's be clear that we don't all mean the same thing by this. But I thought it was interesting that like that was the one thing they've all agreed on so far at the outset.
My question, I think, to both of you, and both of you can feel free to chime in after both of them has responded, is if we look at the original statements for the war and for the invasion, is that the Israeli military was supposed to accomplish a few objectives. Number one, they had to destroy Hamas, the militant terrorist organization. Two, they had to lead to the release of the hostages. And three, they had to make sure that an October 7th could never happen again. So in the conduct of the war so far, do you believe that they have been successful with those objectives? Dennis, why don't you go ahead and go first?
None of us knows yet. Israel is being prevented by much of the world. And it's, I feel that on this entire issue, I'm living in a make-believe world. Every analogy could have been applied to Nazi Germany. There were innocent Germans who were killed by the Allies in the bombing and in invasions and so on. No one denies that. But to point out that there were innocent Germans while the Nazis were in charge is a morally idiotic point. It means nothing. It only means that every innocent German's life that was taken is the responsibility of the Nazis. Every innocent Palestinian life that has been taken is the responsibility of Hamas or Hezbollah. That's it. The analogy is perfect. There is one difference between Hamas and the Nazis. And I never called any group in my 40 years of radio Nazi. I never called an individual that other than the Nazis of the 1940s. But there is only one difference between Hamas and the real Nazis of Germany. The Germans hid their atrocities. Hamas boasts and videos them.
Batya, go ahead.
I think that they have, I would say, destroying Hamas, definitely. They're not going to get every single one, but the idea that Yahya Sinwar will ever breathe open air again seems to me very far-fetched. I think they have driven him underground forever. And, you know, they've cut off the head. And the idea that Hamas will be able to regroup at this point seems to me very unlikely. The release of the hostages, no, they failed on that front. I think they tried. Maybe they could have tried harder. I think, unfortunately, I hate to say this, but I think a lot of them are dead. So let's say about that, but I think on that they've obviously failed. And as to another October 7th, I think a lot of that has to do with what we're seeing now in terms of the realignment happening in the Middle East, to where you see Saudi Arabia clinging to the idea that they too will be able to join the Abraham Accords at some point. The moderate Sunni and Gulf states rushed to Israel's defense, amazingly, to protect them from these Iranian rockets. And to me, that is, you know, I mean, I don't think this is a moral question so much as a strategic one. And I'm sure we're going to get into where does the United States fit into all this? Where do we want the United States to fit into all this? But from that point of view, and an Iran-backed October 7th, should it happen again, is going to happen in a very different Middle East, one in which Israel has a lot of support from the Arab nations, and that makes it less likely as well, I believe.
Yeah,
I'm just kind of, I'm blown away by the statement that Mr. Prager just made, that the only difference he can see between the Nazis and Hamas is that the Nazis hid their atrocities. So if that's the only difference you can see, I have a few others that pop to mind. The Nazis were a government. The Nazis had an army. The Nazis had an air force. The Nazis had submarines. The Nazis controlled from France to Poland in all of Europe, whereas Hamas can't even control Gaza effectively. I mean, I find the statement that you can't see any differences between the Nazis killed.
Do you see a
over
moral difference?
Well, okay, but hold on. But you said that wasn't what you said. What you said is that you can't see a difference. The Nazis, okay, but yes, I see a moral difference. The Nazis killed over 10 million people outside of the war conflict, just in terms of people that they killed, let alone the tens of millions of people who you might hold them responsible for. So yes, I do see a moral difference between the two. I'm not saying October 7th was horrifically immoral, but if you're going to say, do you see a moral difference, that would be like if somebody had murdered two people and you went, I see no difference between that and the Nazis. Okay, yes, they're both immoral, but there's enormous differences between the two. Now, to the other point of the idea of, can Israel eliminate Hamas, even if they were, which I don't think is feasibly possible, that they eliminated everybody who is a member of Hamas. I mean, in order to do this, you would have to look at, you know, if the images of Gaza City aren't enough, you would have to look at images 5 times over of that, and this is going to result in just slaughtering innocent people, not to mention the excess mortality where hundreds of thousands of people are going to die as a result of this in the future. But even then, you would just be dealing with another Hamas-like group. Because if you don't understand what creates this problem to begin with, look, this is the problem. This happens all throughout history, all throughout the world. If you want, there's a reason why the Nazis only rose. First, it was after we imposed Versailles. But then, as you know, it was after the Great Depression, when there was hyperinflation, when things go terrible. That's when the worst, most violent extremist groups rise.
Dennis,
and that's what the future is going to be, unfortunately.
Can I respond just very briefly
Sure,
to that?
and then Dennis can go.
Something really staggering has happened in Gaza since October 7th, which is there have been protests against Hamas. For the first time there were protests actually recently in 2019, but they were quashed by Hamas in a very aggressive, violent way. But the people of Gaza, the innocent people of Gaza, yes, who you mentioned, are speaking out against Hamas because Hamas is stealing their food and their aid. And they are seeing, I mean, they've known all along the role Hamas plays in their oppression. But the fact that Hamas has lost support in Gaza since October 7th, while gaining support massively in the West Bank, right? I mean, which speaks to how different the Palestinian populations are in the different areas. I just don't buy it that Israel is creating more and more Hamases and Hamases and Hamases. I think that there's evidence that actually the opposite is happening, that the people of Gaza are seeing we have to get out of this cycle.
Go ahead, Dennis.
That's insane, by the way.
We'll get to, I'll come to that.
I hate to put it this way, but I mean it sincerely, so I will. You are on record now, because the internet has a permanent memory.
I'm aware.
Of saying that there's no comparison morally between Hamas and the Nazis.
No,
you changed it.
Yes, he's on the record.
For the record,
That is correct.
you changed what I said a little bit.
Yeah.
But sure.
No.
Yeah.
Wait. So
No, I didn't say that.
Wait. All right, you don't. So you think morally they are similar? Yes or no?
You said I can't see anything different about them
Yes,
except
and I was
that the Nazis.
everyone knows I was
listen,
talking morally. Of course, Hamas does not control the same number of countries.
Mr. Prager, what's beautiful about the internet is what you just said. It is on record, so people can see what
That's
I said,
correct.
and then they
It
can
is
see
on
what
right.
you
That's
said.
democracy.
That's right.
Go ahead, sir.
There is no moral difference between the Nazis and Hamas. Both want to exterminate Jews. That is what we're talking about, not whether or not the Hamas has taken over Czechoslovakia. That's an irrelevant point to what I made. There is no moral distinction. Hamas would like to butcher every Jew in Israel, maybe in the world, I don't know, but certainly in Israel. It's in their charter, and that's what they announced. They're proud of October 7th. They are proud of rape. They are proud of burning Jewish families, and the Nazis were proud, but the Nazis hid it, and Hamas boasts about it. That's the one difference.
Cenk, go ahead.
Again, that's the one difference. See,
Yes.
you make the point again. That's not the one difference. There's other differences also. Go ahead. Go ahead.
This is Alice in Wonderland. It's if anybody watched this debate and they didn't know what was happening in the world, they would think, oh my God, I guess Hamas is this giant power and it's been abusing Israel this entire time. Poor little tiny Israel. And Hamas is this gigantic power crushing Israel. What are you guys talking about? Hamas has got pea shooters. They did terrible damage on October 7th. Now Israel's done 30 times worse to the civilians. They've massacred civilians after civilians after civilians. Israel is Goliath. It is not David. It is the Germans in terms of military power. It is not the Jews. The Palestinians are the equivalent of the Jews during the Holocaust. They have been put into ghettos, and they have said, you have no freedom. You will serve us and serve us only. And right now they're saying we're going to have permanent occupation. And wait, so were the Jews not supposed to fight back against the Germans? Do the Palestinians, hold on. Do the Palestinians not have a right to defend themselves? Does it only go one way, where Israel can crush? And how dare you, lowly Palestinians, fight back? How dare you? Now we'll kill 30 times more of you and we'll occupy you forever and ever and ever. And we're supposed to accept that? Are you guys nuts? They're never going to accept it. Never, ever. Batya, I love you, but if you think that the Palestinians are now more anti-Hamas and more pro-Israel, you have lost your mind. They despise Israel, and they will fight. And hold on, this is the most important point. They are going to fight Israel forever, not because they hate the Jews. Oh my God, they're Nazis. Oh, for no reason at all. They were just walking by and all these Jews came by and they hate them. No, they took their land and they still have it. They have them under their thumb. They can cut off the water, the power, the food, and they're starving them to death. And you think that, what, they just coincidentally hate the Jews and that's their driving ideology? No, they're fighting you because you're occupying them. This is the most obvious thing in the world. Why did the Armenians fight the Turks? Why did the Greeks fight the Turks? Why did everyone fight the Turks at the end of World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire? Not because they hate the Turks, but because we were occupying them. And if the Greeks said we want to kill them all, which they did, that did not give us a right to go back into Greece, occupy Greece for 75 years and go, how dare you defend yourself? You hate Turks. We get to kill you forever.
All right, well, we'll pick up on that because this is a legitimate question that I think, Batya, since he named you, you can go ahead and ask. What does legitimate Palestinian self-defense, if there is such a thing, even in your eyes, look like?
Right. Well, so that's what I would ask Cenk. Is everything that happened on October 7th legitimate resistance because the Palestinians are occupying?
Great question. So I condemn Hamas for killing civilians. I also condemn the IDF for killing civilians. And now the IDF has killed 30 times the number of civilians that Hamas did. And I know you guys are going to dispute the numbers because that's a very classic thing that people on the oppressor side do.
How many Hamas soldiers do you think have been killed? I just want a number. How many Hamas soldiers?
So first of all, in terms of the numbers, I go with what is internationally recognized by news organizations and human rights groups.
How many Hamas soldiers have been killed?
So those groups say, no question, that the health ministry, if anything, has been conservative. Well over 33,000 dead overall. They do not know how many of those are Hamas. Israel's at one point made up a number. Like, hold on, let me just finish. Let me just finish. I'm almost done. At one point, the IDF made up a number, 13,000. And then a couple of weeks later, they changed it to 9,000. So it was obvious that it was made up. Do I trust the 9,000 number? No, because the IDF, everything they have said so far has been disproven by news organizations and human rights organizations. So I don't know what the number of Hamas it killed is, but it is a tiny number. And based on the numbers, even if you took the IDF numbers, the 9,000, already the civilian to military ratio is significantly worse for the IDF than it was for Hamas. So if Hamas are dirty terrorists who went and killed those poor civilians along with the soldiers that they killed, well, then the IDF is also obviously terrorists.
Cenk, do you accept Hamas's number that 6,000 of its soldiers? Would you accept Hamas's number that 6,000 of its soldiers have been killed?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so you believe Hamas
because they're going to. No. I don't believe Hamas. I'm saying that at a minimum.
Okay.
Because Hamas could be underestimating, but they're not going to overestimate.
I mean, okay, fine. So, I mean, I sort of object morally to taking Hamas at its word and then assuming that the idea.
I object morally at taking Israel at its word. It's been a far worse oppressor.
Let's get to an average. How about 8,000? Whatever it is.
Let's move past the number.
What is the civilian to combatant ratio that you would have accepted in this war? Is it 0? Like, what is the civilian to combatant ratio that you would have accepted as moral and just?
So when you look at the scope of conflicts across the world, not in the past, but in this day and age, after World War II and the law of war crimes were put into place, there are, generally speaking, some ratios that people find awful but acceptable. It's usually well under 2 to 1. So, for example, America would not drop 2,000-pound bombs. They wouldn't even drop 500-pound bombs in Fallujah when they were cornered. Israel's wantonly dropping 2,000 bombs all over the place, and that is why they have a worse civilian to military kill ratio than Hamas. So do you acknowledge, okay, let me ask you back, do you acknowledge that Israel's worse terrorists than Hamas because they're killing more civilians both as a raw number and as a ratio?
No, Cenk, because
let's get to what the point that he's trying to make is what does legitimate defense on the Israeli parts look like? And this is actually something I'd like to hear from Dennis.
Part.
Well, we'll get to both.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Cenk asked about the Israeli part.
Well,
so we're talking
I don't believe that you don't distinguish between intentionally targeting women with rape, babies, children, families intentionally being dismembered. I don't believe that you think that is morally equivalent to an army that is targeting combatants.
That's hilarious.
You
No.
think those are the same morally?
No. Don't put words in my mouth. Let me just address that. No, I have to address that.
I'm saying I don't believe that you think those are the same.
No. First of all, we're talking about two different things here. So when you say, hey, do you condemn and do you find it morally acceptable that they killed the children and the raped, et cetera? Of course not. That is totally morally unacceptable. But if you say, hey, Israel does not target civilians, that is, I'm sorry, but I think it's a comical point of view. And so they definitely do. And by the way, this is really important, though. When Hamas kills a baby, we all condemn it. Israel has now killed 15,000 children. And you know what they did? They crushed their skulls, they lit them on fire, and they burned them to death. And you know how they did that? With 2,000-pound bombs.
I do want to answer the legitimate
And they did it on
resistance
purpose.
question.
Wrap this
Okay,
up, and then
I
I want
wanna
to get
answer
to
the
Dennis as
question.
well, and Dave, because they both haven't had a chance to talk.
Resistance that targets, if Hamas had only targeted military, we would be having a totally different conversation.
Agreed.
Okay. I think we would agree on that.
Yeah.
Resistance that happens in the West Bank that is nonviolent. I have a very dear friend who's the head of a nonviolent resistance movement in the West Bank. His life is impossible because of the double standard, the double legal standard between Palestinians and Israelis, which is unconscionable. Of course, that is totally. I know you don't know anything about me.
No, I just said I appreciate you acknowledging that.
Take the compliment.
That is totally legitimate resistance. Military targets, nonviolent resistance, BDS. I don't like it. I find it offensive. I find it a double standard, whatever. I support the right of people to resist through boycotts. That's like a time-honored American tradition. These are all legitimate forms. Using rape as a tool of war, not legitimate. And we all agree on that, by the way. So I don't think we disagree about this. It's just when you say that the occupation led to October 7th, it sounds like you're saying that it is justified by the oppression.
Okay, I meant to pause at about this point anyway. I'm trying to wait about this length of time just because it's like, it's a 2-hour debate and I really want to get through it in like a non-insane amount of time. But I'm actually really glad that she said that just now because this is a really good point to zero in on. Because when you say that what happened on October 7th was caused by everything that led up to it, that sounds like you're justifying it. I would just say, look, if it sounds like that to you, then you that's just like saying when I heard you say that, that the conditions imposed on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles created the conditions that helped Hitler rise to power. What I heard was Heil Hitler, right? Like, I would just say it sounds like your hearing isn't very good.
And also, like, obviously they're making the same point about Israel, which is like what Israel's doing right now is justified because of what happened on October 7th,
Yeah, but I mean, like, you can, like, you are not capable of thinking about geopolitics if you can't differentiate between causation and justification.
Of course.
There's like...
They are saying that, like, Hamas and Hezbollah caused these deaths. They're responsible and not Israel.
But I mean, that there are people do things for reasons. It's not just random eruptions of evil, right? You can understand the chain of cause and effects. That's a totally separate question from like whether like what they did in response was morally justified. We could have that discussion later, right? Like you can sort out what the facts are and then move on to the value questions, right? Like this is why did this happen, right? Versus versus was it morally justified? I mean, like you remember, I think we've talked about it before, that wonderful like David Cross bit from like where he's talking about 9/11. He's like, oh yeah, they attacked us because of our freedom. And he's like, really? That was it? Because I thought it was because of the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia, the ties to Israel. And they're like, you know why I thought that's why Bin Laden attacked us? Because because that's what he said, right? Like, you can like investigate in reasonable ways the motives of different actors for doing things and understand why that they happen without saying, therefore I support it, right? Like this is, it's just an insanely basic distinction that she either doesn't understand or, is pretending not to understand.
Yeah. I also just want to, this is going back a little bit, but I just want to know, I quite liked it when Dennis Prager admitted on the record that he feels like on this entire issue, quote, I feel like on this entire issue, I'm living in a make-believe world.
Yeah. In this case, your feeling is correct.
Yeah. Your words.
Yeah. And yeah, what he says, like, yeah, this is actually the minute of this debate we played on Monday to preview that we're going to do this on Thursday, when he says, it's a perfect analogy. Like, which, by the way, I love that. I'm going to start every time I make an analogy in an argument now. After I say it, I'm going to pause and say, by the way, that was a perfect analogy, just so everybody knows, because how would they know if I didn't say it?
Dude, that's probably why you're not winning more people over. It's because you haven't been noting to the audience
that what I just said was perfect.
Fucking park, yeah.
Oh my God, I nailed that. Yeah, exactly. Like, so yeah, it's just I think Dave put his finger on a lot of relevant disanalogies there, and then like the Nazis were in control of this massive, portion of Europe, had like realistic aspirations to, essentially take over the world, right? Become like, one of a couple of dominant military powers in the world, which involved like killing and enslaving like huge, even like, even in like, even like Eastern European Gentiles and like massive numbers. And whereas, Hamas, Hamas does not have any aspirations like that. If you just say like, oh, well, if they could, would they kill all of the people in the group that they think is their enemy? It's like, yeah, maybe, but they can't. And also, by the way, plenty of Israelis, some of whom are currently in Netanyahu's war cabinet, who are pretty clearly in a position where if they thought they could get away with killing every single Palestinian, they'd be in favor of that, right? Just nuking Gaza. So, and then when he says like, it's the it's a perfect analogy. Oh, hold on just one moment. Good tick. All right, sorry about that. It was a knock on the door. It was just a package, but yeah, like when he says it's a perfect analogy, it's like, okay, so wait a second. So you think that like, even if you think like they're like program, right? Like their vision of the way they want things to be is awful in, many, many ways, which it is, right? I mean, like right-wing, religious fundamentalist, et cetera, all true, right? But like, but even if okay, so you think that the Hamas's like complaints about their treatment by Israel, that like lead to like the cause of war in the first place, you think that like those were exactly as legitimate as like Hitler's complaints about Czechoslovakia?
Yeah, and also I think the other thing you're pointing out is that like, even if you believed that that was their program and that was the cause, like they're not even capable of defending themselves. I mean,
Yeah,
even like in mainstream reporting on Hamas, which is not outstanding, they refer to like Hamas, even here, Hamas militants, Hamas fighters. They never use the word soldiers. You never hear like IDF militants. It's because they don't have an army. It's it's very low budget.
yeah,
Even by like the least conservative estimates, it's not very much money.
yeah. Yeah. There's a question about who in the war cabinet. So that Yoav Gallant would be an obvious case of somebody who I think has said many, many Nazi-like things, who's in the war cabinet. So I think anybody who's paying any attention would know that. But yeah, I think that
it's common in mainstream discourse. I mean, Benny Morris has advocated nuking Iran twice, 10 years apart.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean,
yeah. I mean, but it's also like when Dennis was, when Dennis was trying to, like, he really thought he had a point there, and he was trying to press it. He said, like, he kept trying to set it up as a moral as like this dichotomy, like, you think that Hamas is exactly as morally bad as the Nazis, right? Or like they're fine, right? Like that there's no moral objection there. And he was trying to fudge it with, well, is it similar to the Nazis? Like, I don't know, man. It's like a drug cartel that it has like very little like hesitation about like killing innocent people who they think saw the wrong thing at the wrong time or whatever. Are they morally like the Nazis? I mean, they're morally like the Nazis in that they're willing to kill innocent people, but like, that's like, if so, a lot of people around the world are morally like the Nazis, right? This might not be that helpful an analogy.
He also threw in that morally thing after he was called out for just saying there's no difference. And then Dave Smith was like, wait, there's no difference? And he was like, no, there's no moral difference. But then the last time he reiterated the question, he said it again. He was like, you're saying there's no difference, or you're saying, that he left out moral again the last time.
Yeah, but it's like, if he's just saying it's like they're like the Nazis and that the Nazis are morally bad. It's like, yeah, okay. Like a lot of people besides the Nazis are morally bad. I don't know what to tell you there. Like, but it's like, if you're saying they're like the Nazis in that, like, the things that were justified to fight the Nazis would be justified here, then all that stuff Dave said is on the table again, because all that stuff wasn't justified just because there were the Nazis were morally bad people. Lots of people are, right? But like, if you think extraordinary things were justified in order to fight the Nazis, that is in large part because of what their capacities were, right? Like that, not just that, like there were some morally bad people, but like which particular morally bad things they had a capacity to do. And so if, Hamas doesn't have an army, doesn't have a navy, doesn't have an air force, only ever partially controlled like a 25-mile long strip of land, right? Like, and even there was unable to control the airspace, the land borders, the sea border, was unable to effectively defend itself against strikes, etc. Then it's like, yeah, all that stuff seems to be pretty relevant to what would be justified to stop them. That, like, lots of people think, yeah, okay, the Nazis, were not only so monstrous, and, by the way, like, yes, Hamas has committed war crimes, no doubt about it, but like also at various times, they've said that they would be willing to accept a two-state solution, etc., which, Netanyahu has explicitly said the opposite. But like, if you think all that stuff is justified to stop the Nazis, it's because of what the Nazis were in a position to,
Yeah. Also, this is a really dumb point, but like he said that this is the only time he's ever drawn a comparison between the Nazis and a group of people, which in this case Hamas. And I've not looked into that, but I'm like really skeptical of it. Like,
yeah, no, I had exactly the same thought, that I think that actually, this is funny. So I am just looking here. So this is a description of a old debate between Dennis, because I had that exact same thought you just said when he said that. He's like, I'll bet you have, right? And then I did a quick Google search, right, for some key terms that I thought might turn this up. And I found a description of an old debate between Dennis Prager and Rabbi Michael Lerner, who, if people aren't familiar with him, he's like a left-wing rabbi. And in that, and you might think, okay, well, maybe this is a biased description, but this is the description on pragerstore.com, right? This is the Dennis Prager store. And here are the major points in the debate.
Fake news.
And so this is his website, right? His website summary of what he said at this debate with Michael Lerner. It says, point 3, Prager argues that America is a force for good in the world and is in favor of invading Iraq because he believes Saddam Hussein is a modern day Hitler.
Yeah.
Like that took like 10 seconds on Google to turn that up.
Yeah, dude. I bet you could probably find it in like the comment section of like the reviews on like a Nas album. Like, if I ruled the world,
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it's all over the place in his repertoire.
Yeah. Yeah. Saw somebody say champagne socialist Ben Burgis is getting his groceries delivered. I may be a champagne socialist, but that was a package delivery. In any case, let's move on.
One second.
Okay,
So
sorry.
I want to get back to. So I asked originally what legitimate Palestinian self-defense, if it exists in your mind, looks like, and I would like for Dennis to be able to.
Legitimate Palestinian self-defense would be, we no longer want to destroy Israel. Let's make peace. They were offered a state 5 times and they rejected it. Bill Clinton thought that Arafat was a phony, and he did everything possible at Camp David to give them a state. Okay, they don't want a state. They want to destroy Israel. And as regards Palestinians, how's this that none of you like to talk about? There are 2 million Palestinians in Israel as Israeli citizens with the same rights as Jews have in Israel. And not only that, they're pro-Israel. They are more pro-Israel since October 7th than they have ever been. And that is according to Arab sources in Israel. They're occupied. Why aren't they occupied? Why are 2 million Arabs in Israel so happy to be in Israel? Why? Answer that question.
Well,
if Israel wants to commit genocide against, you say genocide all the time. So why are,
if you're going to ask me a question,
I'm asking you both.
Okay, I'm sorry, you were looking at me and you pointed at me.
That's
so
fair I don't distinguish between the two of you.
Okay, I will quote your debate partner. You don't know anything about me. I have oftentimes said that it is true that I would certainly say that I do think, while I wouldn't say they have exactly equal rights, the Arab citizens of Israel, if you were to be a random Arab citizen of any country in the Middle East, I think you'd rather be a citizen of Israel than a citizen of anywhere else.
Is important.
I 100% agree. That is important. And let me tell you something. If you were going to be a citizen in the United States of America or under Saddam Hussein's Iraq, you would much rather be a citizen in the United States of America. That doesn't justify the war in Iraq. That's the point. It is important. I give Israel a lot of credit. Israel is a great country. By the way, I think the entire Zionist experiment is really amazing when you think about it, that a group of Eastern European Jews sat down and said, we've been through so much that we want to form our own country in a land that we've never been to. We want to base it around a language that we don't speak. We want to get international financing. We want to get all this. And they pulled it off. They actually did it, and they made it a really great place to live for the people who are citizens of Israel. That's not really what's in dispute. The point is that there are 5 million people who are under land that they've controlled since 1967. And at a certain point, you can't just claim, like I've heard people argue, this isn't even really an occupation at this point. This is an annexation. They've taken this land and they've basically said
Do you agree that they were given the state 5 times in
No,
which
I do not. No, I do not. And I'll respond to that. Okay,
right,
fine. So let me respond to that.
Yeah.
So you just said that you were talking about Camp David 2. In 2000, you said Arafat was offered everything and he turned it down. 2 things I'll say on that real quick. Okay, number one, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was the acting foreign minister at the time in these negotiations, he said himself in his book, and he said it on an interview in Democracy Now!, that if he was Arafat, he'd have turned the deal down too. And I highly recommend one book that I'll recommend for everyone to read, The Truth About Camp David, written by Clayton Swisher. This guy was a security guard there. He went around, interviewed everybody involved for 3 years after the fact. I highly recommend people read that book. The truth is that, yes, Bill Clinton threw Arafat under the bus after the negotiations, but Arafat wanted to continue the negotiations. The Israelis said no, and the Americans said no. That's a fact.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, no. Okay, so this is an excellent example. My motto on my 40 years of radio has been, I prefer clarity to agreement. We don't agree, but it is clear. You think the security guard at Camp David is a reliable source, and Clinton made it up that Arafat was responsible for rejecting it.
I don't think that Bill Clinton, I don't think that Jeffrey Epstein's rapist friend is a reliable source.
Okay,
yes,
fine.
agreed.
Okay. At the time,
I actually do trust Clayton
Yes.
Swisher. Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's fine. Okay. I don't like Clinton at all, but Clinton,
I knew I'd get you on that one.
Well, you didn't get me. We happen to agree about Clinton's moral character as it developed. Certainly, but
He
the
would
issue.
never lie.
No. Okay. So your claim is that they were not offered a state. Is that correct? Tell me yes or no. I want to understand.
Well, it's not yes or no answer. It's not that they weren't offered a state.
Yeah.
It's that what they were offered, and by the way, we can listen to Netanyahu when he's doesn't realize he's being recorded, and he's bragging about how much he fooled Bill Clinton because he put all these poison pills in the agreement, and therefore they would never really get a state. What they offered them was nothing that really looks like a state. It was you can have technically 96% of it, but there's Israeli controls all throughout it, and all these different sections are divided against each other.
So here's the big picture. I'll be very, very quick. The average Israeli would do anything to get the hell out of the West Bank and to have peace with their neighbors. That is what Israelis care about. They want to raise their kids. They want to have peace. They want to have prosperity. They want to keep producing the most advanced medicines in the world, as the Israeli medical industry does. They don't want to occupy Arabs. It was forced upon them. It was forced upon them in 1967. And one final key point. The Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and others all say all of Israel is occupied land, not the West Bank, not Gaza. Israel is occupied Palestinian land. That is what from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free means. No Israel.
All right, I'm glad you brought that up. We will be getting to the free speech topic on that. Cenk, you haven't been able to speak. I saw you objecting about the occupation, so go ahead.
There's so many things to object to. Look, guys, I'm not on either side in the sense that I want every Israeli civilian to be protected. I want every Palestinian civilian to be protected. And as a Turk, I'm in kind of the middle here as well, because we also occupied Palestine. We occupied a lot of people, right? So I've been on the Israeli side. And oftentimes when I hear you guys talk, you sound a lot like my Turkish relatives, to be honest. And that's not a great compliment because, and I love my Turkish relatives. Sorry, guys. But when you talk about anything that's related to Turkey, Turks are the most angelic creatures that's ever existed. They never did anything wrong to anybody. Golly gee, them occupying. No, those people wanted to be occupied, et cetera, right? So looking at it, when I look at those peace negotiations, for example, I think that in the beginning, Israel was honestly terrible and violated almost every peace treaty they made. In the middle, they were pretty good. And then at the end now with Netanyahu over the last 20, 25 years, they've been awful, okay? So in the middle where they were good, it's actually not the Camp David Accords and the 2000 negotiations. There's other sources. There's one of the lead American negotiators. I believe his name was Robert Malley. I hope I got that right. He said, oh, this was a fraud. We never really presented a real state to the Palestinians. Jimmy Carter said the same thing. So, but Omer actually offered a pretty decent deal to Abbas if it was a real deal. And I think that he should have taken that. I even think that the deal in 2000, it was not great, but they should have tried harder. Arafat should have tried harder to take that deal, because I remember covering it at the time and thinking, guys, I don't think you get it. You have no leverage. America is going to cheat on the side of Israel from time immemorial. They have the greatest military in the history of the world. You guys have no leverage. Just take any deal, because you're going to be occupied forever. So I want them to take a deal, and I want it to be diplomatic, okay? But in the beginning, yeah, but like this idea that Israel is just, oh my God, they just offered everything. And these Arabs, they just always reject peace. That's ridiculous. After 1967, by the way, one of the peace treaty was, hey, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, especially Egypt and Jordan, recognize Israel, and then Israel was supposed to give back the Sinai Peninsula, and it didn't. And that's what led to the 1973 war. So these kind of violations have happened over and over again. So in terms, and I've got to clarify something that Dennis keeps saying. There's a difference between genocide and Holocaust. So is Israel trying to do a Holocaust of the Palestinians or Muslims or Arabs? No. They're not trying to kill every Muslim or Arab or Palestinian in the world. But that's not what a genocide is. Srebrenica was a genocide. That was 6,000 Muslims killed by the Serbs. They were killed because they were Muslim in the area that they were in, so they were targeted based on their race. The same with the Armenian genocide. Genocide means targeting based on race and usually ethnic cleansing. That is textbook what is happening in West Bank right now. And so when you talk about the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, Netanyahu wanted to split those two things up so that he could say, and this is, by the way, in the Israeli press, Times of Israel, Haaretz, etc. And the idea there is so that Netanyahu and the right-wingers in Israel can go, oh, we have no negotiating partner. We have no partner for peace because I don't know which one it is. And I don't, is it Palestinian Authority? Is it Hamas? Oh, look, Hamas is attacking us. Can you believe they're attacking us after 75 years of occupation?
Quickly, Dave, but then I want to get to Batya.
Okay, well, wait, 75 years of occupation. That is exactly the view. I'm glad you said it. That is the view. Israel itself is occupying Palestinian. It has nothing to do with the West Bank and nothing to do with Gaza. You said 75 years. That's how old Israel is.
Yeah.
So, but can I clarify? No, because I want two-state solution. I want Israel to be a safe haven.
So what does 75 years of occupation mean?
20 years we're not.
67. What difference does it make?
Oh, it's a big difference.
Well, I just want to notice, because as you're pointing out the strategy of Netanyahu to prop up Hamas, which is widely reported, and I saw you nodding at that. I think there's no denying it at this point. But it's hold on. But
and humiliated Abu Mazen at the same time.
Right. So, but let's talk about this a little bit, because I think this all kind of ties together here, and it's one of the points that Dennis just made, where you said, look, Israelis don't want to occupy these territories. And that certainly is true. This is my point about being collectivist versus individualist. That is true for many, many Israelis. There are lots of them who were very happy. They were all behind Yitzhak Rabin. Let's make a deal. We don't want to be occupying these guys anymore, right? But then there's also members of the Likud party and people like Benjamin Netanyahu. And one of the explicit reasons, which he has stated in his own words and many high-level Israelis, I could read quotes to you guys for the next hour if you want. They've all said it. The reason why they wanted to prop up Hamas was not only, as Cenk said, so that the international community would never recognize Palestinians, but so that those Israeli citizens wouldn't be able to put pressure on them. Because if it was the PA in charge, so many people in Israel would say, hey, they want to make a deal, let's make a deal. And so the Likud party cynically, intentionally funded and propped up this terrorist organization that is every bit as bad as you've said, Mr. Prager. I agree with you on that. But here's the deal, right? So if that's true, which we all know is true, if that's true that the Likud party propped up Hamas so they wouldn't face internal pressure and they wouldn't face external pressure to give the Palestinians their freedom, then I'm sorry, that blows up the Israeli defense for this war, that, hey, it sure does suck that we got to kill these innocent people, but we got to get these Hamas. You propped up Hamas so that these innocent people would never get their freedom. You don't then get to use that group as an excuse for why you can slaughter them. Sorry, no reasonable person can defend that.
For the record, so that everyone knows, it was the Palestinian Authority, before the word Hamas was ever known, that murdered all the members of the Israeli Olympic team in the Munich 72 Olympics. that this portrayal of the Palestinian Authority minus Hamas as wonderful people is sick.
No,
Okay,
but that's
go
but the
ahead.
point is
For
they
the record,
change.
it's
Yeah, but the
Israel
point
that
is, see, but this is such a
5.5
cheap.
million
Sorry,
prisoners.
Jake, that's such a cheap cop.
Prisoners.
That's such a cheap cop out to point to one atrocity in history.
Wait,
It is an
all
atrocity.
the blown up buses, all the blown up
All the
schools.
blown-
What are
What
you
happened
talking
in
about?
Yasser Dayan?
That was all
15,000 kids
PA.
murdered.
Okay, so hold on.
Israel just murdered
Yeah,
15,000.
But I'm sorry,
They didn't
all right,
murder
crushed
them.
their
Cigar,
heads.
They didn't
cigar. Can I
murder
just
them.
say one thing?
Murder is
Just one thing
deliberate
quickly.
killing.
No, we have to.
Sorry, all right. But
Everybody
to
is the
just point to one atrocity and then say get out of jail free
I think it
card.
is objectively true that there has been atrocities that have been committed by the PLO and also by members, not necessarily of the Israeli government, but certainly
Yes, of
Israeli
the Israeli
paramilitary
government.
organization.
Much
Sometimes
more
the
so.
Israeli government as well.
I mean,
Batya, I do
100%
want to get the
Israeli
response.
government's not
I do want to get the response to this whenever it comes to the genocide question, because that's one that is very hot right now, specifically for the American audience. This is a key point of the intra-left debate around Joe Biden and his candidacy. So, Batya, I would like for you to respond and to make the case around why Israel is or is not committing a genocide. We'll stick on this question and we'll get some responses from over here as well. So, Batya, go ahead.
I don't believe Israel is committing a genocide, precisely because of how Cenk defined the word genocide, which is the intentional targeting of a people based on their ethnicity or their race. And that's clearly not happening here. I mean, first of
We'll get to you, Shane. You're coming. All right.
aren't you curious what
You're
I'm
up.
going to say?
You're up soon, but Dave is next. All right, go ahead.
You know, they're not being targeted because they're Muslims or Arabs or Palestinians. They're being targeted because Hamas has embedded itself within a civilian population, right? None of us would accept, I hope, that if they had only killed, let's say 6,000 Hamas terrorists, that would be a genocide, right? We would understand that that was a military campaign to rid Israel of a danger threatening to its civilians. These people who have been killed as a result of Israel's attempt to eradicate Hamas. And so to suggest that they are being targeted because of their race or, I mean, we don't believe that. We know that that's not the case. We know that if they were Palestinians living in Israel or living in Jordan, Israel would not be committing, they would not be dying as a result of Israel's actions. And furthermore, you can point to all of the ways in which Israel has tried to move the civilian population out of the way. They moved 1 million people out of northern Gaza into Khan Yunis and into Rafah and into southern Gaza to get them out of the way. Now, I see you smiling. You're probably thinking to yourself, oh, she's proving my point. It's ethnic cleansing. But here's the point. I mean, it's either the ethnic cleansing charge and the genocide charge are a little bit contradictory, right?
Okay.
Wrong. They're not a little bit contradictory.
Yeah, they made all those people move to those places, and then they bombed those places.
Yeah. They have repeatedly throughout the let's just go ahead and call it a war for the sake of argument. Throughout the war, they have repeatedly bombed people in places that they already made the move to, ending at like Rafah, which is like the last place they made everybody move to. Where they're currently dropping 2,000-pound bombs on refugee camps. So like babies get beheaded by the bombs. Like little kids are incinerated and have to have like burns all over their eyes operated on without anesthetics because Israel bombed so many of the hospitals, destroyed so much of the medical infrastructure. But yeah, like it's not like genocide and ethnic cleansing are not are not in conflict. In fact, if you look at the legal definition of genocide, right? So from the UN's Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the crime of genocide, right? That they have it's like it has to do with there's a series of acts, which is like a pretty long series of acts that can count as instances of genocide if they're done with this intention of destroying in whole or in part. And absolutely, under international law, that definition of destroying an ethnic group in whole or in part includes, like, if you're intentionally killing large numbers of members of a group with the intention of forcing them to leave an area, right? That you don't want to allow them to be allowed to leave in an area, that is absolutely within the legal definition of genocide.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. Yeah.
Well, I do then want to go back to some of the two of the claims that Dennis Prager made earlier. One is he said there are, Israel can't be an apartheid state because there are 2 million Palestinians who live in Israel and have all the same rights as other Israelis. And, I think Dave Smith correctly said he was in passing, you could blink and you'd miss it, but he correctly said, well, I wouldn't say all the same rights. And, this is very true and very important because there is much more discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? The Israeli Arabs than there is against like any minority group in the US, for example, right? Like to the point, there's like no comparison, like restrictive housing covenants where you say, nobody can like sell a house. We all signed a contract. Nobody can sell a house in this area to a black person. Those used to be legal in the United States, but those have been illegal in the United States for many decades. Those are absolutely illegal and very common, right? In Israel, right? Like that's like one. Oh, sorry.
Legal, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. It's absolutely legal, right? Like that's absolutely legally allowed and in fact pretty common in some areas. In Israel, for example, lots of land is controlled by the Jewish National Fund, which is quite blatant about ethno-religious discrimination and who land will be leased to. So there is way more discrimination against those 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel than there is against any minority group in the U.S. But it is true that those 2 million people have most of the rights of any other Israeli citizen, right? That's true. Again, lots of de jure blatant discrimination, lots of de facto discrimination, certainly a very second-class status. Culturally, I mean, there's something called the nation state law that officially designates Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people and not of any other group. Israeli Jewish parties always say it's like really important to them that like their governing like majority to form a coalition government not rely on votes from Arab parties because they worry that would destroy the Zionist legitimacy of it, right? So like imagine if there were separate white and black political parties in the U.S. and Democrats and Republicans openly said, well, we can't have the black parties support us because then we wouldn't be legitimate, as a white government, right? Like that's the equivalent of what we're talking about here. So I think that the rosy picture he's implying is inaccurate in a lot of ways, but it is true that if every Palestinian had the rights of those 2 million Israeli Arabs, then I don't think anybody would call Israel an apartheid state, right? Like that's like, if everybody, there's like discrimination for sure, right? But like, that's not really what people are talking about, right? As bad as it is, and it is pretty bad, right? Like, as bad as it is, that's not what people are talking about when they call Israel an apartheid state. What they're talking about when they call Israel an apartheid state is the millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who have been subjects but not citizens of Israel for the last 57 years. And yeah, Cenk does keep saying 75, but I think he's just messing it up. I think he means 57, right? Like I don't know, maybe he's being unclear and he's kind of conflating 75 years of various kinds of atrocities against Palestinians, which would be very true, right? Versus like 57 years of occupation. But like, I think he kind of caught himself in anyway.
Or maybe, I guess I assumed he was talking about 1947, but that's still.
Right. But I mean, this is right. But like 1947 is, the Nakba certainly, right? So like atrocities, but like, but he was saying occupation. And so I think he just kind of had his wires crossed there about the numbers, right? Because he is definitely a two-state guy. Much more than I am. I think a two-state solution would be better than what we have now. But I actually think I agree with like what Edward Said said in 1999, that like real justice would just be like a binational state with rights for everybody. But in any case, yeah, I mean, what people are talking about when they say Israel is an apartheid state isn't those forms of sort of discrimination and de facto second-class status against Israeli Arabs, as bad as that is, right? Again, way worse than the treatment of any minority group in the United States since, 1960s, in like, the last several decades, right? I mean, like not worse than like during Jim Crow, but the last several decades, way worse. What they're talking about is those millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who've been spending 75 years being ruled by Israel and but aren't citizens of the state, right? And this also connects with the second thing I had written down that Dennis said earlier, which was the average Israeli would do anything to get the hell out of the West Bank. And, I don't want to slip into treating entire national or ethnic groups like hive minds. I mean, obviously there are plenty of like honorable dissidents in Israel, but that claim is also pretty weird because like, let's slow down on this. Depending on which numbers you believe, estimates vary. Somewhere between 5 and 10% of Israeli Jews live on settlements in the West Bank right now, right? So when you say, oh, well, the average Israeli, would do anything to get out of there, it's like, well, I mean, 5-10% of them live there, right? Like it gets a little bit less clear what that means. And I would also point out that Netanyahu has said over and over and over again for like many years that there will never be a Palestinian state, which would imply that Israel never gets out of the West Bank. And, he does, he has won several elections. I mean, granted, he might, he was on track to lose one before October 7th, but like, he has won several elections. In fact, much more than Hamas has, right? Like, I mean, Hamas won a plurality in one election, in 2006, not a majority, a plurality. Right. And it was, 18 years ago. So, this is, so like, if you're going to make claims about the average Israeli and the average Palestinian, which I think is a stupid game to play anyway, right? Like, I don't think you should, I'm not really interested in sort of treating those as like, group entities in that way. Right. But like, if you are going to make those claims, that's pretty relevant to the comparison. And you could say, well, lots of Israelis who might have liked a two-state solution just kind of grew discouraged with it. And, they supported Netanyahu for this reason or that reason. It's like, okay, fair enough. But you could make the same point about Gazans who voted for Hamas in 2006, right? That like lots of people who aren't fundamentalists and, aren't even necessarily one-staters voted for Hamas just as like a protest against the corruption of Fatah and the sort of complicity of the Palestinian Authority with the Israeli occupation, through the Oslo framework. So, the same point would apply there. But like, I mean, the idea that like, oh, the average Palestinian burns to, for like apocalyptic, revenge against, against Israelis, whereas the average Israeli would love nothing more than a two-state solution. It's like, yeah, I mean, you also keep calling Israel a democracy. Well, its government opposes a two-state solution as a matter of policy, and 5 to 10% of its Jewish population lives on the West Bank. So, this is, again, none of this is to say all Israelis are like this or all Israelis are bad or anything like that. But I mean, just as a factual question, it's really hard for me to see what standards he could be applying to get there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I don't really know what he means by it either. Like, is it like they're so under threat? Like, or is he saying like they're just such fervent supporters of the cause that they feel like they have to stay there, even though they don't like it? It's just the right thing to do to move into this annexed territory. Yeah, I'm not even totally sure like what he's trying to evoke there.
Yeah. Anything else we should hit here before we keep going? I know there's a lot.
Yeah, no, I feel like I probably forgot some stuff that came up a while back, but that's all right. It'll come back to me. I have some notes too, so.
Yeah. Oh, well, actually, sorry. So there is one other thing that I do want to bring up here, which is that I've played this on the show before, but for people who might not have seen this on the main show, it's relatively short. Like this is just kind of beautiful on the Camp David question, right? And I do think that Cenk is soft pedaling a bit, like how bad the Camp David offer was, but also
Absolutely.
the idea that Arafat turned it down flat is also just wrong, right? I mean, they were continuing to negotiate, and on that subject, right? So, and I loved, by the way, look, I disagree with Dave Smith on most things besides this stuff. You know, I debated him twice, but like, you know, he has gotten really good at this, and I do love that moment where it's like, oh, yeah, well, Bill Clinton, that's the guy you said, like, you know, is a trustworthy source on this, friend of Jeffrey Epstein, no, Bill Clinton. But on, you know, on the question of like who else, you know, who might have some credibility in a mainstream sense has said this. This is a clip of Morning Joe talking to his then future father-in-law, Zeb Brzezinski, former national security advisor of the United States under Carter.
Throwback. Well, he's the trilateral guy, or
yeah, no, he's like a guy with like, you know, I have many, I don't think is a particularly good guy, but has deep establishment credibility. Let's see what he says.
What do we do the next time Israel is attacked from an outside force? What do we do at that point?
That's the wrong question.
No, that's not the wrong question, because we never get the condemnation of Hamas or Hezbollah. It's always after Israel responds to defending itself.
No, it's not. The problem is that this conflict has lasted for years, and the United States has been largely passive. So the right question is not what do we do when things break down. The right question is what do we do to avoid a breakdown by being engaged seriously in the peace process. And for the last 8 years, we haven't been. And that's why we have the mess like we have right now in our hands.
You can't blame what is happening in Israel right now on the Bush administration.
Yes, you can.
No, you can't.
Well, look, Joe,
let's go back to 2000, Dr. Brzezinski. You and I both know Bill Clinton gave Arafat and the Palestinians everything they could have wanted.
Such a stunningly superficial knowledge of what went on that it's almost embarrassing to listen to you.
Oh, is it?
If you were to look more closely at what happened in the Clinton Camp David discussions, you would know that what we have just said is absolutely wrong. There were all sorts of provisions and catches to the so-called proposal, and it wasn't rejected. The negotiations went on in Taba, and then there were elections in Israel. And Sharon came in, and everything got aborted. In the last 8 years, we had a policy in which we have proclaimed an interest in peace. Condi Rice has traveled 16 times in 21 months to the region, proclaiming, you must do this, you must do that. But the United States never exerted itself. So the issue that Obama faces, and that's a question that you raised, is, are we going to be sitting there issuing condemnations, whether it's of Hamas or of Israel or anybody else, or are we going to be seriously engaged in the peace process? That is the question.
We have another block, and I'm very excited about that because I'm stunningly superficial. Chief, I look forward to you educating me and the rest of America. Hold on, the rest of America and the rest of the foreign policy community who have said time and again, Arafat walked away from the best deal he could have got, and that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
You're repeating slogans. You're repeating slogans. He did not walk away. What he said was, I'm going to take the proposal to all of the Arab capitals and see how they react, because the proposals were controversial. And then negotiations went on, even after Christmas, where Clinton and Arafat met, and they were going on in Taba in January, after Clinton was already leaving office, and then the process got aborted. It's helpful to know a little bit about it.
There's very exciting, Chief, that you know things that the rest of the international community doesn't know.
You're going to judge your knowledge by the sort of collective standards of 300 million people. Then don't be surprised that you're embarrassed.
I'm not embarrassed. I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to throw those away, and anytime I have a question, I'm going to call you up.
Let me spell it to you. TABA, Taba negotiations. Look them up. It will be helpful.
I'll do that.
Awesome. Unlikely hero.
I know, right?
Brzezinski from the third turnbuckle out of nowhere. One for the people. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's just, yeah, that's the clip I want people to watch every time they repeat this claim about, Camp David and Arafat was given everything and he walked away and all this. It's like, one, no, he wasn't, but like two, he didn't walk away, right? That's like literally not what happened. And yeah, like it's Zeg Brzezinski, all the, establishment foreign policy credibility you'd want. And also, it's just awesome to see Morning Joe's then future father-in-law talking to him that way.
Yeah, right. Oh man, I bet holiday dinner's gotta be. Yeah.
I was gonna make one other point about this. Oh yeah, so when Dave and Cenk were talking about Likud, which by the way, right, is every time this comes up, it's important to note that they also say use the phrase from the river to the sea in their founding charter. And except they don't mean like, look, I think somebody in Hamas says from the river to the sea, they mean like an Islamic state from the river to the sea. I'm obviously against that. But like if somebody like Rashida Tlaib uses from the river to the sea, she obviously means like a secular democratic state with equal rights for Jews and Arabs and everybody else from the river to the sea, which actually sounds pretty good to me. But like, look, when Likud talks about it, right, they want Israel to control everything from the river to the sea. They don't mean that like then all the people who live there get to be Israeli citizens, right? I mean, they're talking about a single apartheid state from the river to the sea. So when Likud leaders, Sharon and then Netanyahu, cynically propped up Hamas, that, part of that was a divide and conquer strategy and that there'd be much less appetite in Israel and in the international community for a deal that was with them rather than the Palestinian Authority, all of which is pretty obviously true. Then Prager tried to do this bizarre deflection about the murder of the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972. As I saw somebody point out in the chat, that was actually carried out. I mean, he was like trying to say, see, the Palestinian Authority is also bad. It's like, well, okay, Palestinian Authority didn't exist in 1972. But if what you mean is the PLO, I mean, actually, as somebody was pointing out in the chat, that's, the Black September organization is who did Munich. And that seems to have been kind of a distant, like, break-off faction from the PLO. It's like unclear if there was still any meaningful relationship with there. Those seem to be like anti-Arafat people anyway. But also it's like, look, that's not even the point. It's like, yeah, can you find bad things that were done by the PLO? Of course you can, right? But it's like, what does that prove exactly? Yeah. Like, you think that like much worse atrocities were committed by the Israeli military?
Yeah, and I think even in that instance, it's not like that just happened out of nowhere. Like, and I believe that was like months into the conflict at that time.
Oh, the Munich Olympics?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was like, it was a while into the conflict. Right?
Yeah.
That's 1972, right? So that's like...
into that particular exchange. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to
pretend it up with another one too, because there's plenty. But
yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I know everything about the chain of events leading to like something that happened in 1972. I certainly don't, right? But like, I wouldn't be surprised if you're right about that. But like, even if it wasn't, like, okay, right? Like, what is that? I mean, I would be surprised if it came out of nowhere. That seems unlikely to me. But like, but either way, it's like, all right, and right, like, how, this is, I mean, presumably, if there ever was a two-state deal, I mean, it's like, yeah, it's going to be signed by Israeli politicians who signed off on all kinds of atrocities.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. So it just seems completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because Because if they were trying to commit a genocide and could just simply, eradicate the world of Gaza's Muslim population, surely they would not be moving civilians out of harm's way while they're trying to get rid of the presence of Hamas in a certain place or not.
Are you saying that it is more akin to an ethnic cleansing, or it's not a genocide?
I think it's really funny to both claim that Israel doesn't do enough to protect civilians and then to use a word like ethnic cleansing, like a nasty, accusatory, racist word, when they actually did try, like ethnic cleansing, like to suggest they're doing something, racist when they tried to protect the civilian lives of the people living in northern Gaza.
I want to get Dave. Because you dominated last time, so Dave, you're up.
Okay, so look, I want to just say that in terms of the charge of genocide, I don't use the word genocide. I just think that the debate devolves into semantics every time you use it. The international legal definition of genocide is so incredibly vague that it's like if you try to destroy a nationality or ethnicity in whole or part. So then, like, if you were to murder 2 people of an ethnicity, is that I just don't even care about the debate. I'm saying it's wrong. And in terms of the term ethnic cleansing, there is no debate. Every single new historian in Israel concludes that there was ethnic cleansing at the beginning of the creation of Israel. Now, I know, I'm just making that point. I just want to go back to revisit something here because I literally just made what I feel is the most important point of all of this about that. I think the entire Israeli defense is destroyed when you add in the component that they intentionally propped up Hamas so that the Palestinians wouldn't get their freedom. And as a response, Mr. Prager invokes an atrocity that happened once. And okay, that was an atrocity.
Only because I didn't have
let me just finish. All right, well, let me just finish. Yes, I know you could invoke
spend the rest of the day or evening.
Yes, okay, can I just finish?
Non-Hamas Palestinian atrocities.
What happened to Deir Yassin? You want to have
Deir Yassin was 1948.
So what? Okay,
there is no war in the history of the world where you have not had.
So it's a cop-out. So
no, it's not a cop-out. I'm acknowledging Deir Yassin was awful.
Okay, so by the way, hold on. Let me just finish my statement, and then you guys can continue.
So it proves what point?
Exactly. It proves nothing. My point is it proves nothing. Because I'm mirroring how your point proves nothing. You're just dodging. You're just dodging the point that I was making about this current war. Yes, it's objectively true. There have been horrific, ungodly atrocities committed by both sides.
Not both sides. That's a lie. That is a libel. It is not true.
Oh, it's a libel. Okay.
Other than Deir Yassin, which was during wartime of a village, and absolutely terrible. Tell me where there's been Israeli atrocities comparable to Palestinian atrocities. Go ahead. Everybody quiet. Name it. Or you libeled.
Yes. Wait, so why is the one wait, hold on. So the one I said doesn't count. Why? Because it was during wartime?
No, because it is an exception.
Oh, so
to make a generalization, Israel commits atrocities and Palestinian commits atrocities. You can't name one other than in 1948 in a village during a war. That is a libel of Israel. And you're
hold on. So, listen, you can keep saying the word libel. That's fine.
It is a libel to morally equate atrocities on both sides. That is a libel.
What does he mean by libel?
Libel means, Israel is as guilty of atrocity as the Palestinians is a libel of Israel. I don't know why that's complex.
Hold on. Well, I was asked the question here. Well, I'm just saying if wars don't count, then fine. But if you want to ask for the atrocity, it's happening right now in Gaza. So I don't know what point you're trying to prove.
So these are atrocities.
Yes.
Oh, I see. So this is the same as blowing up school buses of children. You
I didn't say it's the same.
Equating them.
No, I didn't.
Then you're using the same term.
No, you said that. I didn't say that.
Okay,
I'll be very, very quick. My point was that you mentioning an atrocity that happened in the past did not counter the point that I just made, that this destroys Israel's defense for this war. And I just made the point that I could name atrocities too. You're now claiming that I'm equating things that I never said were the same and accusing me of libel, which is tired. Sir, respectfully, it's a tired accusation.
They both commit atrocities is tired. Okay, that's what.
No, that's a fact. That's a fact.
That's a fact.
Okay, go ahead, Cenk.
Yeah, well, he lives on a different planet. Okay, so first the genocide thing. Let me just finish that real quick,
and then live on a different planet.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So first of all, just finishing up the genocide real quick. Every genocide defender says the same thing. And I don't mean it in a personal way, guys. I just mean that the Serbs literally at the International Criminal Court said, well, we didn't target them because they're Muslims. We targeted them because they were there and they were against us. The Turks said, we didn't target them because they're Armenians. It's because they struck us first and they did this rebellion and they were killing Turkish civilians. What the hell were we supposed to do? We had to move them and we had to kill them. So we had a right to defend ourselves. You're mirroring exactly what every defender of a genocide says. Well, and what I say back to the Turks, my own people, is, yeah, you didn't kill Norwegians, you didn't kill people from Botswana, you killed Armenians and you targeted Armenians. And in the same exact way, Israel is targeting Palestinians. The fact that it's because they're there doesn't help that case at all. You're moving them, you're killing them, and you're targeting Palestinians. That is a genocide.
America target Germans.
Okay, so hold on. I haven't even, that's just a quick point on genocide. I didn't even get to the actual thing because he's making a point about.
Mate doesn't agree with the word genocide.
Okay, I don't care.
Between,
okay, so I don't care at all. Okay. So there's a lot we don't agree on. He's a libertarian and progressive. So
we disagree on everything. It's just this is so terrible. We agree on this.
Yeah. So now the core of the thing is, like, this is the reason I said Dennis lives on a different planet is he says, name one Israeli atrocity. Everyone out there that isn't an Israeli supporter is screaming into the camera right now, right now. So, for example, Hamas killed 34 kids on October 7th. I came out immediately, condemned it in the strongest words. I can't believe it. Well, how is that helpful? It's immoral. It's counterproductive. It's dumb. It's terrible in every way. 34 poor Israeli kids. There are now 15,000 dead Palestinian kids. And you're telling me that Israel hasn't committed atrocities? So guys, what we are seeing with our own eyes is that Gaza is decimated. They destroyed the entire place, and 85% of and over 85% of Palestinians have been displaced. There's 1.1 million people starving to death, and you still can't see it. And that's what's amazing about bias, that you look at how they have killed over 33,000 people. Okay, say 6,000 as Hamas, say 9,000 as Hamas. You still have 25,000 dead women and children. And you go, what atrocities? They have kill zones. Why did they kill the 3 Israeli hostages? Because they were in a kill zone. In a kill zone, they murder everyone in the kill zone. There's sniper bullets in kids' heads because they were in a kill zone. They've killed more journalists than all other conflicts this year combined. They've killed 3 times the amount of humanitarian aid workers. The World Central Kitchen, they murdered those people. There was a 6-year-old who was stuck. They told the IDF, we are going to get her. The IDF said, okay. The IDF goes and finds her. They'd already killed her, the rest of her family members in that car. They then killed not only the 6-year-old girl, but everyone in the ambulance that came to rescue them. And you're saying you can't see a single Israeli atrocity? And one last thing. They have kept these people. Hold on. And the last atrocity is keeping 5.5 million Palestinians prisoners. And Prager says, oh, not 75 years, only 57 years we've kept these people prisoners. And think about the absurd claims that you guys are making. Oh, the Palestinians are fine inside of Israel. I can make the same exact claim for black people during slavery. Well, they were fine in the North. We had a democracy in America. What are you guys complaining about slavery in the South? They were treated perfectly fine in the North.
Last point there, we actually have to do a quick read from our sponsor. So Dave, if you don't mind.
Do we have to do a quick read?
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey guys, you know what I love? Debates about Israel and Palestine. But you know what I hate? Woke corporations. People are waking up and realizing that their daily spending habits are shaping this country and empowering radically destructive ideologies. It's time to change that. Welcome to a new marketplace, a place where you can buy everything your family needs that respects traditional American values. Whether it's a big box realtor's agenda across the line, or you're trying to support more small businesses, Public Square, that's where you got to go. They are ready to help you find new favorites from people just like you. Public Square is on a mission to restore the culture through the power of commerce. This isn't just about boycotts. It's about helping you switch to something better. It is now easier than ever to vote with your dollars. Public Square is America's marketplace where freedom-loving Americans like you shop their values. Visit publicsquare.com today. Shop for quality products, services, and exclusive discounts from value-aligned businesses. And that was endorsed by Cenk Uygur of the
Wow.
Young
No,
Turks.
he's like, no.
Just so you know, if anyone sitting next to me fully supports this message.
Yeah, okay.
All right.
Okay, so
I totally thought that was a. When did you realize he was actually reading the ad that Sagar had queued up?
I thought he both knew that it was really funny, but it was actually
Yeah, because like for the first like the whole, you know what I love, debates about Israel-Palestine. I was like, okay, this is a bit. Where's he going? He's gonna like do his bit, and then like Sagar's gonna read the actual ad. But then it was like, wait a second, that is the ad.
He
Okay.
definitely really enjoyed that. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the ratio you'd accept is such a dumb question.
Especially
Like-
after that example too. Like, how about not the one where we kill a whole family and a small child and then everyone in the ambulance? Whatever ratio doesn't involve shit like that would be a nice starting point. You know?
Yeah. I mean, it's because it's, I mean, one, the ratio on any estimate is ridiculous, right? Like, you know, Dennis Prager, his perfect analogy was World War II. More German soldiers than civilians were killed during World War II, right? And that was even with the Allies using kinds of bombing that would later become illegal due to the Second Geneva Convention that happened after the war. In fact, you know, codifies current international laws of war in large part because World War II was so brutal and awful that there was a widespread consensus that we have to make sure we never fight another war like that again. But even in that context, the Allies still killed more German soldiers than civilians. And, you know, people will say, oh, but it's different because it's urban warfare. This isn't a bad ratio for urban warfare. It's like, yeah, you're writing yourself a weird moral pass that you think that it's like, oh, see, if I'm bombing the shit out of heavily populated areas, then it's okay that this many civilians die. It's like, no, that's why it's bad to bomb the shit out of heavily populated areas. And, you know, the real question, I think, you know, beyond like, yeah, if you're killing 2 innocents for every Hamas fighter, that's horrifying, right? That's a horrifying ratio. And you only get to 2 innocents for every Hamas fighter if, again, I'm going to keep repeating this, you help yourself to the assumption pulled out of thin air that every adult male killed in this, you know, by Israel is a Hamas fighter, which is obviously a nonsense assumption. Obviously, most of them are not Hamas fighters, given that there were only an estimated 30,000 Hamas fighters in Gaza out of 2.3 million people. And we're talking about, you know, indiscriminate slaughter and destruction on a scale that, you know, means that 85% of the population was displaced from their homes. And like on even the most generous estimate, more than twice as many civilians were killed in about 6 months than Russia has killed in, you know, 2 years, killed in the first 2 years of the war in Ukraine, or certainly that the US killed in 2003 in Iraq, etc. And, you know, so, I mean, this is like, you know, so these are, you know, this is like really insane, you know, but the question to, you know, again, it's only 2/3 if you make this assumption that's obviously false, right? Like if you correct that assumption, it's way more than 2/3 are civilians. But also I think the ratio, like, oh, as long as it's under this ratio, it's fine. It's like, well, no. If you're doing things that, you know, will kill large numbers of civilians, then that's not okay, right? I mean, it's about intention, and the intention is pretty obvious. I mean, if you drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a crowded refugee camp, right, then the intention is to kill massive numbers of civilians. That's not an accident, right? I mean, that is what you knew would happen, right? And you did it on purpose, intending that outcome. And especially, like, look, what was the, you know, is there like the idea that there's a military justification for displacing 85% of the population is such a bizarre insult to everybody's intelligence, especially when, look, the people who are moving are going to include, according to you, the people you're trying to kill. So it's not like that even saves them from being killed. It's like, oh, see, we moved them to make sure they'd be safe. It's like, no, you kept bombing them after you moved them. And then, like, I think what's really telling is the destruction of infrastructure that, like,
Yeah.
you know, I mean,
Also a war crime. Yeah.
yeah, it was definitely a war crime, right? But I mean, it's like, look, every single university in Gaza has been reduced to rubble. The last one that was still standing was destroyed, not even by aerial bombardment, but by controlled demolition. Which I think they said was like I don't know, there's like something had gone wrong and like somebody had misunderstood their orders or something. The one university where at least the library was still standing, right? Aqsa University, Gaza City, an IDF soldier actually posed for a picture in front of the burning library.
Great.
Yeah, like posing, reading a book as the shelves are in flames behind him. I mean, it's like, look, it's such a weird insult to people's intelligence to claim it's like, oh, see, they're only trying to kill Hamas fighters. Like, no, they're trying to make Gaza unlivable for Palestinians. They're trying to eliminate the possibility of anything like normal Palestinian life resuming in Gaza when this is all over. Because, I mean, again, what does Ben Gvir say quite openly, right? That the end game is mass transfer, voluntary mass transfer, right? Which, like tons of current and former Israeli officials have said the whole thing is the same thing. Netanyahu has been a little bit more coy about it, right? But this is like, yeah, that's obviously the end game. I mean, like this, if your goal was to make sure there was no Hamas, it's like, look, we spent 20 years destroying the Taliban in Afghanistan. How did that go, right? Like the idea that this kind of like super heavy-handed, brutal counterinsurgency is going to mean that there are just no more militants anymore is obviously crazy. We've tested this theory over and over again. So unless you think that the Israeli decision makers are all idiots, right? That's not the goal, right? I mean, the goal is to create the conditions for, voluntary, mass transfer, which, so it's just like talking about the ratio. It's like, no, looking at the clear intent behind the actions, right? It's like, if you kill 100 soldiers, but also like snipers take aim at and kill 10 children, right? The ratio isn't bad, right? But you still committed a war crime.
Exactly. That's one of the points I was going to make. Almost exactly that point is like, let's assume the ratio is 1-to-1 or lower than that, and you just made the first point about that. And I would also add that, like, under international law, the occupied force has a right to defend itself and use violence to do that. And the occupying force does not have the right to use violence to defend itself. So even if you're just killing militants in this situation, that's still not acceptable under international law. And I would also just add that I think that in the United States in particular, and maybe I'm wrong about this because it's quite possible they just don't care or think there would be any consequences anyways. But I think that's one of the main reasons that there's so much effort into putting obscurity and debate around the question of whether what Israel is doing constitutes an occupation. And that was ruled upon in an advisory opinion by the UN court in the earlier 2000s. I can't remember the exact year, which was actually sent on. It was an advisory opinion that was originally sent to them to provide an opinion on the border wall, but they found it relevant to include these other aspects of what Israel is doing that still constitutes occupation. How you can't just like pull troops out, control everything, everyone, and the surrounding area, and claim that you're no longer an occupying force. And I think that like they've tried to obscure that distinction a lot because it is illegal to use armed forces when you are an occupying power. You don't have the same claim to self-defense that the occupied power does.
Yeah. And somebody being in a heavily populated area has nothing to do with anything. I mean, that's Netanyahu meets with his war cabinet in a building in Tel Aviv called the Kiryah. That like a Israeli friend took me through this once, where like its exact location downtown Tel Aviv and all the stuff that's around it, right? Like shopping mall where you can often see uniformed soldiers, at the having lunch at the food court, like right next to it in one direction. All the main bus lines, go past it. The hospital over here, by the way, connected to the Kiryah by tunnels. High school over here, right? It's right in the middle of all that stuff. And so, look, if there was some force, somehow Palestinians got somebody to come in with like a real military, and they just cluster bombed the fuck out of that area of downtown Tel Aviv to try to like destroy the Kiryah, yeah, they would have a legitimate military target, but it still wouldn't be acceptable to do that. That would still be a really serious war crime, because Netanyahu and his associates are putting themselves in the middle of a heavily populated area full of civilians. And so it's like, that's not just a free pass. That's like, oh, well, what are we supposed to do? Right.
I think that's called human shielding, Ben.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's this is like in the exact sense that people say Hamas is doing human shielding, because, Amnesty International, which does not like Hamas, has like accused Hamas of various other violations of the laws of war. But after the previous conflicts, they've repeatedly cleared them of human shielding in the sense of like directing movements of civilians to shield military operations. But that's not what people mean. What they really mean when they say human shielding is like having military stuff close to civilian stuff, which is like, yeah, what the IDF is doing is totally human shielding in that sense. But here's the thing. If you actually care about the humanity of the people, quote, being used as human shields, unquote, then that doesn't like, it's not like, oh, they're being used as human shields, their life is forfeit, right? Like this is my favorite moment from when Anna Kasparian was on PBD, that, the host like brought up human shielding, and she was like, okay, Patrick, you mentioned your mom earlier. Let's say your mom was being used as a literal human shield, like in a hostage situation. Would you be in favor of the cops shooting the hostage taker through your mom? Right. And he's like, oh, and he just blatantly refused to answer. He's like, oh, that's not the same. I'm not going to do some hypothetical. It's like, yeah, if you actually care about the humans being used as shields in the sense of being close to legitimate military targets, it's not acceptable to go after the military targets in ways that will kill large numbers of them. This is not complicated.
And that reminds me of another thing that Howard Zinn pointed out in his essays, which is about the war in Afghanistan being justified by the search for bin Laden. He's like, if somebody commits a major atrocity somewhere, like, you don't like arrest everyone in the neighborhood,
Yeah.
That analogy reminds me a lot to like the kinds of apologetics people make for killing so many civilians in Gaza with the excuse of looking for Hamas, even though, again, as I mentioned earlier, they're often doing that while also admitting that they don't know where the militants are. But even still, like, using that argument, it's just crazy. Like, none of us would want to be treated that way if like somebody or some group of people in our neighborhood committed a murder, that wouldn't give the excuse to the police to just come in and start shooting. And
yeah, well, I remember after the war in Afghanistan started, I think Norm wrote something where he was like, oh, do you think like Christopher Hitchens, who's like supporting it shamefully, that like, do you think Christopher Hitchens, who's written all the stuff about Henry Kissinger and all those crimes against humanity, would think that other countries would be justified in invading and occupying the United States in order to capture Henry Kissinger? And like, I've read Hitchens' response to it. It's like, it's his worst work because he just blatantly dodges the question.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't have an answer to it, right? Because it's like, yeah, by what possible standard is bin Laden worse than Kissinger? Like, it's like, yeah, 3,000 people in New York, terrible, terrible thing. Doesn't hold a candle to Cambodia.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm being told in terms of we're going to move on to the Iran section in a little bit, but Dennis, I did promise that you were going to be able to respond on the genocide question, so I want to give you that chance before we move on to that section. Go ahead.
Well, I keep referring to two things, but repetition is the mother of pedagogy, as I learned in the course of my life.
Good line. Good line.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Because I know how important it is. I don't learn the first time. The United States can be accused, or Britain could be accused of committing genocide in Germany. The United States could be accused of committing genocide in Japan by the exact same criteria as, quote unquote, Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. When did it stop? When did the American bombing of Japan or of Germany stop? When they surrendered. If Hamas surrendered tomorrow, gave up the hostages that are still alive, I'm sure they killed quite a number. But nevertheless, if they did that, if they surrendered and that would end the issue, it would end the issue the next day. Israel doesn't want to bomb Palestinians. The reason that there are so many Palestinian civilians being killed, whatever the number it is, and that is a tragedy, it is not an atrocity. There's a difference between tragedy and atrocity. Atrocity is deliberate, tragedy is not deliberate. Israel does not deliberately target civilians. Hamas deliberately puts civilians in the way of targeting them. That is the way in which they have created it. One other thing, you will probably know this because it was in Newsweek. A member of the United States military who teaches at West Point said that Israel has been the most moral army in urban warfare that he has ever You laugh at him. That's correct. That's right. You're allowed to laugh at him. He did write it, and so did the head Kemp, Richard Kemp, the head of all British forces in Afghanistan, said that Israel, the IDF, is the most moral army he has ever encountered. Which, given that he is a member of the British Army and is a high-ranking, I think, a general, that is particularly powerful phrase. That's the truth. They do everything they can not to kill civilians, and it would stop tomorrow if Hamas surrendered.
Okay. I know this is going to be infuriating for you guys, but we do have a clip that we want to play. This is going to be on Iran. Feel free. We can come back to this in a little bit, but I do think it is important. So this is a clip which has been curated for us by Zero Hedge. This is Benjamin Netanyahu on the topic of overthrowing Iran, something he's advocated for since the 1990s. And specifically, we want to focus in after the clip about why the U.S. should support Israel in its endeavors, in its defense against Iran, if it chooses to do so. Let's take a listen to the clip now, please, and let's see it.
Obviously, we'd like to see a regime change, at least I would, in Iran, just as I would like to see in Iraq. The question now is a practical question. What is the best place to proceed? It's not a question of whether Iraq's regime should be taken out, but when should it be taken out? It's not a question of whether you'd like to see a regime change in Iran, but how to achieve it. The application of power.
And so that clip, I wanted to turn to you guys. Dennis, actually,
what year was that? I'm sorry. What year?
2002. That was December 2002, prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Right.
Dennis, you just spoke, so Batya, I think we can go to you. This is specifically on the Iranian question. And I think about U.S. support. We are in America, after all, as to why should the United States, should it defend Israel in the Iranian retaliation for the Israeli bombing of what the Iranians claim was an embassy, of what the Israelis claim is a IRGC military outpost. So why don't you go ahead, and then I'll get some response from Dave.
I think the question is a little bit backwards. I don't think Iran would have retaliated from Iranian soil rather than from a proxy, as is its wont, had it not picked up on signals from the Biden administration that it was weakening in its resolve and its support of Israel. So that is the question here. Is I think the order is reversed.
Yeah,
and I think that it is historic that Iran attacked Israel from Iranian soil. And so it is extremely significant that, according to, my analysis, many others, that was the direct result of Biden's wavering support, which can be attributed to, 100,000 voters in Dearborn, domestic politics, let's say, right? The youth vote, what have you, right? His need to signal, I'm not behind Israel in the way that you think, to the people who he thinks need to hear that in the United States. As for whether we should support Israel and its retaliation against Iran, I consider myself an America First person. I think probably we would agree when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. I do think this is significantly different because, the Iranians and the Houthis, they're not only chanting, death to Israel, they are chanting death to America. They do see us as linked from a values point of view with Israel. Most Americans agree with them. And so it seems to me to be sort of odd to say, well, the Americans who think that are wrong, the Iranians who think that are wrong. We also get a lot of extremely material benefits from our allyship with Israel in terms of military intelligence, which has saved countless lives, both American and Israeli and European. In terms of our military industrial complex, maybe you don't think we should be, have an industry that makes trillions of dollars to the United States GDP that's based in weapons, but we do. And Israel has made us a lot of money in that regard, and actually sacrificed developing its own military industrial complex that would have competed with ours. So arguably, I actually think this is true. Israel loses more by getting American aid than it gains.
Great.
Although,
then we'll stop.
although I think America probably gets a lot out of that, but ultimately that is a question for voters to decide. I would not be at all, that is a question for voters to decide. I do think we are linked in the mind of Iran and in all of the minds of their proxies, and that's why we should be supporting Israel.
Dave, go ahead.
Oh, well, yeah, I completely agree that Israel is great for the military-industrial complex. So, I mean, if that's your pitch for why we ought to support them. Look, I would highly encourage people to educate themselves about this if they haven't already. I'd encourage people to read a piece called A Clean Break, A New Strategy for Securing the Realm. I'm sure you're familiar with it, sir. It was written by Richard Pearl and David Wormser in 1996. And this was a letter from two people who both served in the George W. Bush administration, very influential neoconservatives. And they did not write this letter to Bill Clinton, who was the president at the time. They didn't write it to Bob Dole, who was the Republican nominee running for president at the time. This was written to Benjamin Netanyahu. And it was all about how regime change in Iraq will be in Israel's interest, because then you can break up this peace process that Yitzhak Rabin started down, and we won't have to do this anymore. You'll have security in the region. Benjamin Netanyahu, coming in 2002, testifying before Congress as a regional expert, explaining how if you overthrow Saddam Hussein, there's going to be peace in the region. It will have this sweeping effect where it makes everything better. Aside from the fact that they all got it all wrong, and not just wrong, but like disastrously wrong, the biggest catastrophic disaster in modern American history level wrong. I just do not understand how you can square the circle of claiming to be America first and also claiming we must unconditionally support a country who is clearly trying to pressure us into anti-America first policies. Look, this is just a fact, okay? Every president of my lifetime, Trump might be an exception to this, I'm not sure, but everyone else wanted a two-state solution, including, believe it or not, George W. Bush. After 9/11, Colin Powell, who was the wisest member of the George W. Bush administration, I don't think anyone would argue against that, he still sold the war in Iraq, even though he didn't believe in it, so he'll have to talk to his maker about that. But he told George W. Bush right after 9/11, you got to do a two-state solution, and you got to do it now, for two reasons. Number one, you got record high approval ratings. This is the time to get it done. But more importantly, because he knew this is what drives so much of the terrorism problem that we have. It's not that Iran sees us as the same as Israel. It's that they recognize that we've been propping them up. We're the ones who shoots down the resolutions at the UN. We're the ones who funds them and arms them. Okay, and what happened? George W. Bush couldn't get it done. It was Tom DeLay. John Mearsheimer's done great reporting on this. It was Tom DeLay in the House who told him, you'll be a one-term president if you even try to do this, okay? Every American president has wanted a two-state solution. Again, maybe not Donald Trump, but the rest of them all did, and they couldn't get it done. All I'm saying is if you're America first, how can you support the fact that we have a political system where our elected representatives get rebuked by a foreign country? That is not America first.
The reason he would have been a one-term president is because the American people would have rebelled, right? Not because Bibi Netanyahu would have come here and made sure that
No, I'm sorry if you're going to ask that. No, it's also because there's a giant, powerful lobby advocating on behalf of a foreign government who makes it their mission to ruin the lives of anybody who's critical of that foreign government. That's a part of it too. By the way, the evangelical Christians, that's also a big part of it. So yes.
The idea, can I just need to respond?
We gotta get Dennis in here. Okay.
I'll yield.
All right.
Then I'll speak. I'll yield and then speak. Okay.
Well, the idea that some lobby is the reason that an idea has power in the United States is completely backwards. The lobby gets its power because it is representing where the majority of Americans are at. A lobby on its own, you think the NRA,
you don't think it's shaping
you
it a little
think that
bit?
the NRA is the reason that people have guns in America? Really? You
No,
don't
the
think
NRA
that?
are a bunch of sellouts.
No,
Sorry, Jay.
No, but the idea, like, it's a very good parallel.
Americans have overwhelmingly supported Israel. If there was no AIPAC, they still would have supported Israel.
So then why do we need an AIPAC?
Oh, because
Why do we need an NRA?
Yeah, exactly. All right, fine. So you.
I don't
all
think
right.
we need AIPAC
Yeah.
either. Israel would be
Okay.
just fine without it because
Great.
the American
Another deal.
people have its back.
Go ahead, Chris.
Whether
Yeah.
we need it or not is not the question. The
Okay.
question is, why do they exist, given the fact, which is fair, why do they exist? Because people lobby politicians on behalf of what many Americans support. Americans to this day and every poll still support Israel, as it happens. So the arguments that have been offered here, it really is a different planet. Just for the record, this may come as a shock to the two of you, at least, perhaps many listening. And I would put my hand on a Bible. I would take a lie detector test because obviously there's no way I could prove this. When I remember sitting at the edge of my bed watching this, and I never watched TV. I watched Arafat and Rabin shake hands, and I had tears in my eyes. That is how badly I wanted peace. I supported a two-state solution nearly all of my life, certainly since the Six-Day War when I was a college kid. I have always supported it. I no longer support it, just like nearly every peace activist in Israel no longer supports it. And we don't support it thanks to Hamas and thanks to the PLO, because they have made it clear if Israel leaves the West Bank, they will get another genocidal, if you want to use the term, a genocidal terror group of Nazi-like Hamas people running it. Why have there not been elections? Why is the PLO not allowed elections for, what is it now, 16 years? Because they're afraid Hamas will win.
Agreed. I agree. I just want to because I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, what a tragedy that peace deal didn't work out. You know, and I totally take you at your word at that. I was just wondering if either of you guys would respond to the point that I made before, that you just kind of brought up the Olympic atrocity after that.
Just
hold on, but it's just like, so if Hamas is so horrible, and I know you guys would both say Iran finances Hamas, and so they're evil for that. What about the government of Israel doing it? Do we have anything to say about that?
Right. So when you are, I'll tell you, I'll give you an answer. The United States supported the second greatest mass murderer in history after Mao, Stalin, in order to defeat Hitler. It is very common to support scum to defeat bigger scum.
So who's the bigger scum than Hamas?
The bigger scum was those who wanted to destroy Israel.
Okay.
But isn't that Hamas?
You're right. So it's both. So that invalidates your argument.
No, it doesn't at all.
Anyway, okay.
No, you just have no argument. Who's the bigger scum?
No,
Who's worse than the Nazis?
Please.
You're right. No, other Nazis.
Okay.
You're right.
Okay.
They're equivalent. I don't understand. Why is that? Why is that?
Batya,
Just not an answer. I'm
Batya
sorry.
needs to respond. She's been trying.
Yeah, he lost control of that analogy midway through.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, when did Dennis Prager support a two-state solution? I mean, certainly not.
Did he say it out loud, or did he just support it in his head?
Right.
And because I'd be very curious about that. It's like all these Republicans now who are like, oh, I was against the war in Iraq. It's like, yeah, do you say that with your mouth? They're like, are we just supposed to believe in the privacy of your own thoughts that you're against it? I'm very skeptical about that.
Take you at your word that you cried watching C-SPAN one day, even though you never watched television. Another claim I'm very skeptical about Dennis Prager.
So it was
certainly he never supported the two-state solution that is voted on in the UN every year. He never supported. I mean, we'd know from things he said in this debate that he certainly doesn't support, and never supported a two-state solution on the pre-June 1967 borders.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would put down money that Dennis Prager has never supported Israel withdrawing all the way to the pre-1967 borders. I mean, maybe he wanted the Clinton-Brock, deal at Camp David, but certainly not like a deal based on the 1967 borders. That was such an amazing interaction because he was like, it's like, okay, like his justification for Israel propping up Hamas is, well, it's like supporting Stalin against Hitler. So it's like, but wait a second, who's Hitler in this analogy?
Yeah.
Because like you already said Hamas was worse than the Nazis.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so like it would have to be somebody who's worse than Hitler is the equivalent of Hitler, and then he just couldn't come up with it. It's like, because pretty clearly the people Hamas was being supported to counter were like Fatah, right? I mean, that's the, and it's like, are you gonna claim now that Fatah is worse than Hamas? And it's like, and that he's obviously not going to claim that, right? Like even Dennis Prager isn't going to do that. So he was just like, I don't know, maybe not.
He knows they were supported to whatever extent they were because they were extreme.
Yeah, exactly.
Painted that way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Let's I want to start this is already going to be a long night, and I'm afraid we're going to have to, if we're going to end at the same time, we might have to put off the very last part of it till later. But I do want to go to the post game. If we're going to do like another hour for the post game, I do want to go to that pretty quickly. But let's watch just like one more piece of this first.
Totally.
Trying to respond, and then we have to bring it back to the Iran question too.
I have two main responses to that. I think it's a really important point. I don't disagree that it was a disastrous, in hindsight, disastrous. At the time, I thought it was disastrous because, as you say, it's not just, it wasn't that Netanyahu was giving Israeli taxpayer funds to Hamas, but he was facilitating the transfer of cash from Qatar. Okay, so let's just be very
sent the head of Mossad to Qatar to make sure the cash came back in, specifically for the reasons of keeping Hamas in power, so he didn't have to give them a
But it's not that he is giving them the money, right? It's not coming from Israel. I just want to be clear. There are a couple things I want to point out about that. The first is he didn't do that because he thought Hamas was capable of October 7th. He did that because he thought they had no power, that they had no real ability.
He thought he could control the height of the flame, were his words.
Just hold on, Dave, please.
Yes, he thought that they were less of a threat to Israelis than the potential of a Palestinian state led by Abu Mazen. And as a result, he humiliated routinely Abu Mazen, who represented the non-violent camp. That it was criminal at the time, and in hindsight, even more so. But to say that he was propping up the people who then would do October 7th, I don't think that is fair. Not because I
didn't say that.
Because he was doing it out of a complete misunderstanding about what they were capable of. And the second point that I would make about that is you left out something very important in your narrative of how things went from like the beautiful Israel that like was coalescing around Rabin to the like horrible Israel in which Bibi Netanyahu was able to cobble together with much difficulty, by the way, the ruling coalition that he has now that I'm sure we would all agree is not the one we would like to see in power. Not that we're stakeholders or voters there, but you left out the second intifada, which is extremely important. 1,000 Israelis, 700 of them civilians, murdered, going to school on the bus, children murdered, blown to pieces. That was the equivalent of 50,000 Americans dying over the course of 4 years. That changes a nation. That is the reason that the Likud vision was able to get to a place where not a ruling majority, but was able to come.
Why don't you think that second intifada happened during the Oslo Accords?
We're
and it wasn't until Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli.
I just think that this disrupts your clean narrative of Bibi Netanyahu being the person who propelled, who enabled October 7th to happen as some sort of.
I think that point's been made. So Cenk, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I haven't spoken since we started the Iran part, so I have about 12 things to respond to. So I like that Dennis acknowledged that Netanyahu and Israel did prop up Hamas. So there you go. Now we know.
Truth. But she gave the answer. He did not know what monsters he was supporting.
Oh, he didn't know who Hamas was. Come on. Okay, and it's because he wants a permanent occupation. And I'm glad that Dennis just acknowledged he also wants a permanent occupation.
No, I don't. I'm not for two states now. I pray for two states eventually.
Eventually,
okay, yes,
so,
but not now.
More years,
not now.
75 more years.
It will be.
Yeah, he literally said within 10 seconds, I'm not for a permanent occupation. I'm not for two states. So what's the secret third thing besides a permanent occupation in two states? I mean, he said he prayed that eventually, but like say that it's like, oh yeah, I hope I hope that eventually, something can happen in a way that I would support is like very different from supporting it, right? So you support you want to say it's not permanent because you hope that it might not be permanent, but it's like you support an occupation for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, exactly. And have no plan beyond that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And yeah, the fact that like he's the fact that he's worked his way all the way from like where he was earlier, which is like all Palestinians are evil because the Black September attacks in Munich, to as he's like trying to follow the contortions that the argument is imposing on him, he's worked his way all the way from there to, well, Netanyahu in like, what are we talking about here? 2010, 2013, didn't understand that Hamas was very bad.
Yeah.
Like it's like, oh, he didn't know what monsters they were. It's like, well, wait a second. I thought you were just saying that even the PLO were horrible monsters, but now you're saying that like Netanyahu like didn't understand how bad Hamas was. It's like it did. Like, I mean, you said it earlier, right? They were being propped up because they were extreme.
Yeah. And also I would just add to like, it's very frustrating with the historians and pundits or whatever in America on this subject versus Israel, because the ones in America are their main line of argument is to pretend that all these things aren't happening or all these things weren't said or done. The Israelis are very their whole argument is they're like proud of saying and doing those things. They're very open about it.
Oh my God. Yeah. Every day. Like there's such a disconnect.
People like Dennis Prager in America, or even, I mean, Dershowitz to a lesser extent, because he has a, I think, harder time hiding the fact that he's such a psycho. But he's also probably a little smarter. It's the same every time. It's like, with Joan Peters, it's like these people weren't there. Benny Morris, it's like, yeah, they were there and we fucked them up.
Yeah. Every goddamn day since October 7th, especially, it's like everybody, like all of the apologists in the West are just repeating lines on autopilot from previous wars. It's like, oh, most moral party, most moral army in the world. They're going through like all of these extraordinary measures to protect civilians, unprecedented measures. And meanwhile, like every day in Israel, there are politicians being like, yeah, we need there to be mass hunger in Gaza or else we won't be able to recruit informants. That was like a Likud MP, MK, right? Member of Knesset, in like a speech on the Knesset floor, or like, Yoav Gallant, being like, yeah, no food, no water, no medicine. We're fighting human animals, right? Like, or, Ben Gavir, it's like, yeah, the long-term goal is mass population transfer. Like, that just like, it's just never been so obvious that like what Israeli officials say for Israeli audiences is just not even on the same planet as like what all the Americans who defend them say.
They're literally, their main argument is to deny these, that these things are happening, that the Israelis are bragging about happening. It's totally nuts. I had a point on there. I forgot it.
All right.
Yeah. 100 more years.
No.
How long should they be your servants?
As soon as Hamas,
your prisoners. How long would you like to keep the prisoners?
They're not prisoners. As soon as Hamas,
they're literally prisoners.
As soon as Hamas gives up, surrenders.
No, because that's his position. He just said he doesn't want it.
When were we prepared to make peace with Germany? When the Nazis came out of power. If the Nazi-like Palestinians are out of power, I would have peace the next day.
Yeah. Okay, that's all right. So he says, okay, an indefinite occupation where we will keep the Palestinians under our thumb and our boot, and until they know their role, then maybe we'll consider freeing them. But until then, they will have to serve us. Okay, very Christian of you, or whatever it is that people say these days. Okay, so speaking of Christians, there's a giant Christian Zionist movement here, and they are also part of the reason why the polling turned out okay for Israel throughout a lot of our history. But by the way, they are now greatly dwindled. And that is why the polling for Israel in America is not as good anymore. And by the way, the fact that Israel has made it, Netanyahu has made a deal with the devil, with those Christian Zionists, is abhorrent, because if you push them on what they plan to do, they said, oh yeah, we love Israel, because then Jesus is going to come back after
They
Israel.
never say that. I know
They
them,
they
but
definitely say it.
they
They've said
never
it
say that.
1,000 times.
Okay,
And then he's
I'm-
going to
I'm
murder
not-
all the Jews.
I'm a Jew, and I'm
Congratulations
telling
with
you,
doing a devil.
he doesn't know what he's
Deal
talking
with the
about.
devil, okay?
Okay.
So, okay, all right. Guys, come on now.
All right, fine.
Okay, so and AIPAC. Look, Batya, you just said that Israel's helping us because they helped the military-industrial complex, and they have lobbyists just like everybody else. These lovely lobbyists. Okay, I don't think you realize how unpopular those comments are. So yes, AIPAC is definitely lobbyists, along with the Christian Zionists. They definitely influence politicians. The reason Tom DeLay said you'll be a one-term congressman is because he said the Christian Zionists will turn on you, and the evangelical base will turn on you. And AIPAC will turn on you. AIPAC's about to spend.
Right the first time.
No, they're both.
But don't those
Okay,
voters
so
have a right
hold,
to vote for who they want?
guys.
Go, continue.
Okay,
Continue, Cenk.
so if you guys are saying that the $100 million that AIPAC is promising to spend in the next election is not relevant to the politicians, that these politicians are angels, they would never consider millions of dollars given to them in bribes, I mean campaign contributions. And that actually determines almost 95% of elections, not the AIPAC money, but lobbyist money overall, that they don't take that into account because Joe Biden's an angel. He took $11.2 million from AIPAC, but that didn't affect him at all. He's the #1 donor that got money from AIPAC in United States Senate history. Who's the #1 donor for Speaker Johnson? AIPAC. But you guys say no. Ted Cruz, AIPAC. No. Those beautiful angels would never be affected by the bribes, I mean campaign contributions that AIPAC is giving them. And by the way, it is not just AIPAC. Guys, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, they love this war. Are you kidding me? A giant war in the Middle East, they're going to make so much money. You're talking about the oil companies are going to make billions, maybe trillions from this. All of those different lobbyists are bribing both the Republicans and the Democrats. So there is massive money that is going into this potential war. Now, this war, we've seen this movie before. It was the Iraq war. And yes, morons, warmongers like Netanyahu said, oh, we're going to be greeted as liberators. How'd that turn out for us? Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq. I am not going into Iran. I will do a massive rebellion inside America, and I bet I get a ton of right-wingers and a ton of left-wingers, and there's not a single American troop that's going to go into the Middle East to die for Netanyahu, not one. If you try to send one of our guys into the Middle East, we're going to stop paying taxes. Will be a massive tax rebellion.
You know what?
I'm not going to give
one. We just stop right now, man.
Dave,
Let's
you've
not
got
even wait
Dave
for this
really
war.
going. Dennis, I think to return to the Iran question, you can respond to that as well, but make the case for why the U.S. military should defend Israel against Iran as well.
I did not,
in some of your comments.
You didn't say the U.S. military.
Well,
you said
Israel-
whether
Okay,
America
all right.
should support.
All right,
I did
fair
not
enough.
suggest.
All right, fair enough.
Israel
Okay, I
has-
said U.S. supports.
Israel
You're
has
right.
made it clear
Good point.
all of its existence. It doesn't want one American soldier to
Yes.
die in Israel or to fight in Israel. Okay, I just want to make that
Just
clear.
the money and the jets.
That's
Okay.
right. That is correct.
No,
Just the money
yeah.
and the jets. That is right.
Okay.
So if you feel
You'll notice that, and I guess maybe we can talk about this for a minute, but then we should go to the post game for patrons, but to finish up. But you notice that Dennis just, actually, I think it's the first thing he did tonight that was kind of clever, albeit in a misleading way. You notice he just shifted the goalposts because the question was, should the U.S., the question was about Iran, right? Should the U.S. Go into Iran? And he was like, well, Israel has always been clear they don't want any American soldiers dying in Israel. It's like, yeah, in Israel. But Netanyahu could not have been clearer over the decades that he would like the United States to attack Iran.
Oh, and yeah, they've been trying to garner support from the U.S. to support that for, like you said, decades now.
Yeah, I mean, literally that quote that he read.
Even in the lead up to Operation Cast Lead, they were trying to get the U.S. to invade Iran.
Oh, way before that. I mean, that quote that he read.
Oh, no, definitely before that. But
yeah,
I'm saying even in the build up to that, by all, I mean, in terms of proportions, they killed ridiculous amount of civilians, ridiculous amount of children, as they always do, but still a pretty small exchange if you're comparing
compared to this. Yeah, no question.
Yeah.
Like,
and,
yeah,
and even in that tiny incursion, they were trying to fuel support from the U.S. and military backing from the U.S. to invade Iran.
yeah. And again, it's not like Netanyahu has been very clear. I mean, that quote that Saga read earlier was from before the invasion of Iraq. And Netanyahu was already talking. I mean, you think he was talking about an Israeli invasion of Iran? No, he was talking about a U.S. invasion of Iran, right? Like, he wants the U.S. to do regime change in Iran on Israel's behalf. He could not have been clearer about that for like the last 20 plus years. And Dennis knows that. So it's, he's answering the question of like, should the U.S. attack Iran to defend Israel with, well, Israel has said they don't want any American soldiers dying in Israel. It's like, yeah, again, it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
No, it's
also, I mean, there's Israeli officials and mainstream Israeli scholars, I mean, mainstream meaning very much accepted in the sort of intelligence community there, who've publicly advocated nuking Iran. So, and I mentioned one of them earlier, Benny Morris, has advocated that over a span of time, and others have made kind of cryptic comments about, descriptions of what they could do to Gaza that imply a nuclear attack and things like that. So,
yeah, totally. Yeah, and this really does get down to this like amazing contradiction that like Batya was like, well, I'm an America first person, I'm against war in Ukraine, etc. But this is different. Right? It's like, well, hold on, that's an awfully big but to like put in that sentence, right? It's like, I'm America first. I don't think the US should be getting involved in foreign wars, except for this is different. And then her whole reason for saying that it was different was, oh, see, like Iranians and Houthis and all these people, they don't just chant death to Israel, they chant death to America. It's like, yeah, I mean, Dave pointed this out, but it's like, yeah, that's in large part because of the US support for Israel, right? It's like the very policy that you're advocating continuing, right? Like that's not just like random aggression to, to the US. That's because the US was already doing the thing that you're talking about. It's a huge part of the reason why. And like, this is like the same thing that like this move that people always make rhetorically that drives me crazy, where they're like, well, there's a difference between how we should think about what Israel does here and, Russia, this, that, right? Because Israel is an ally. It's like, look, that's just a different way of saying that the U.S. is supporting them. But if that's the issue, it is in dispute, is whether the U.S. should support them.
Problem. Yeah.
So it's like, if you say, well, we should, like, you're essentially saying we should support them because we support them. When you say we should support them because they're an ally, you're just saying the same thing in two ways and putting because in between. What's that?
And also, like, it's not as wrong. It's not as wrong if they kill tens of thousands of people in several months, as if one of our enemies does.
Yeah. Also, if you look at the polling, there are, I mean, we've talked about this before. I mean, there's a lot of polling where there's like a huge percentage of Americans whose like immediate instinctive response to what's going on right now is that's awful, right? Does that mean they're going to vote based on it? Maybe not, right? Like there's a hardcore who will, but like I agree with the points you've made to me in the past that like, most Americans unfortunately don't prioritize foreign policy to that extent, right? So it's like, I think it could definitely hurt Biden enough at the margins. In a tight election, the margins could could be enough, right? Like to lose the election for him. But like, yeah, most voters, it's nowhere near their top priority. That's true. But like,
Not only that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
But even aside from like this sort of stuff right now, like on the more general issues of like, should the U.S. cut aid to Israel? Do we support Israel too much? Should we be like more of a neutral arbiter? The polling is way more mixed than Dennis and Batya are letting on, right? Like, I mean, you know, from every poll I've ever looked at, it actually seems like Americans are pretty split on that. And so it's like, yeah, it is pretty like, you know, it's not like, oh, AIPAC exists because of all the popular sentiment. It's like, well, there's a certain amount of, you know, there's like one large chunk of the population that, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe they don't quite agree with the extremist AIPAC position, but like they're, you know, have this sort of generally pro-Israel views. But there's like another large chunk of the population there's like, no, why do we give these people all this money? Right? Like at the very least, like whether or not they also have all the other views I'd like them to have, I'm sure most of them don't, right? But like at the very least, they're like, oh, why do we give these people all this money? And that second group doesn't have the political influence of the first group, not because it's less people, but, you know, I mean, Cenk is not wrong about this. It's because like it's the, you know, the position of all these billionaire donors, right? Like that's really like what AIPAC reflects, right? It's like, this is always, you know, this is always like, maybe this is just a more general worldview thing that Batya denies this. It'd be pretty funny if she did, because as far as I can tell, a big part of her shtick is that she's like a populist right winger who actually cares about working class people. But like, look, are we going to deny as a general fact that like money spent by lobbyists has an influence on the political process?
She did. She said that lobbyists lobbies exist because they reflect the popular sentiment of the voters. That's what she said, which if you believe that about every lobby in this country, I mean,
oh my God, right. It's like the NRA. I mean,
how could you work at Newsweek and be around these fuckers all the time and believe that? You know, I just don't. Yeah, it's incredibly naive. Like,
oh yeah, absolutely. And like, you know, I will lodge that Dave said an insane thing about the NRA. I know he was half joking, but I think he's kind of being half serious too. But like, yeah, look, I mean, you look at like most Americans' views on gun laws, and it's like, and like, there's like a lot of, you know, I mean, look, there's a whole complicated argument to be had about the specifics, but like, there's a lot of gun control measures that would have majority support, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, clearly the NRA has like an outsized influence, right? Like they have way more influence than the percentage of Americans who would go as far as they do on this issue would support, because they, you know, throw around all this money, right? Like this, it's just a bizarre thing to deny, right? That it's like, you know, and yeah, then like there was that beautiful moment where she was like, oh, well, maybe we don't need Apex. Like, okay, well, you know, I hope somebody from AIPAC watches this and they dissolve themselves.
Yeah. Finally, we agree.
Oh, good God. Okay. Well, we've been going for 3 hours, and which is normally how long we go, main show plus post game. But we probably won't finish the entire thing tonight, but we'll at least try to finish most of it in the post game. So I already posted the link for patrons. If you're not a patron, there's no time like the present. That's patreon.com/Ben Burgis, BenBurgis. $5 a month, get the post games every Monday and Thursday nights, access to the Discord server, sometimes advanced access to things, mostly our undying love and gratitude for helping keep this going. So if you are a patron, though, you should see that link. If you aren't, go to the Patreon, you should see it. And I will see you beautiful people over there. I
also plug my Substack real quick.
Oh yeah, please. I also do have a link to your most recent Substack in the description. But yeah, verbally plug it now, please, by all means.
Yeah, no, just for the
please.
For the 3 to 5 people who've been waiting on the part 2 of the Jimmy Davis story, that is up. And
yeah, I mean, I know we're about to finish, but I mean, just in like a few sentences, do you want to kind of remind people in a general sense what that is?
Yeah, Jimmy Davis Jr. is a death row inmate in Alabama. Was convicted in 1993. Has been on death row since 1994. I've been writing about his case for the past 12 or 13 years, and am writing a series right now for my Substack about mostly about the trial itself, more than any other aspects of his life. The so far 2-part series. The first part focuses on reasonable doubts as to his guilt and evidence of an unfair trial, and then the second part focuses on race, class, and basically character attacks in the way that different characters are painted in the courtroom. So that is the Jimmy Davis story. We did a show on capital punishment together where, you know, a lot of my thoughts on the subject are laid out in that. But Jimmy Davis Jr., very few people know about him. Possibly innocent person on death row in Alabama, certainly a victim of an unfair trial and an unfair sentence, I would say. And yeah, love for people to hear the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the link to part 2 is in the YouTube description down there below the box where you're watching us. So do check that out by all means. It's really important reporting. And if you are a patron or are taking the opportunity to become one right now, I will see you in the post game. I don't know. I should probably run my dog out to pee for a second. So let's call it 5 minutes. And I will see people then. Left is best.